The carriage wheels ground to a halt in front of iron gates that looked more like a prison entrance than a threshold to marriage. Lillian Hawke pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, her breath fogging the glass. 22 years old, and she'd never felt more like cargo being delivered. Somewhere behind those gates waited a man she'd never met, a duke the servants whispered about in hushed tones, a recluse who'd let his own brother die in a mining accident and hadn't been seen in society since. Her father had called it an opportunity. Her mother had wept. And now here she was, about to marry a ghost with a title. If you're watching from London, Boston, Sydney, or anywhere else this story reaches, stay until the end. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this journey travels. The gate swung open with a shriek of rusted metal that made Lillian's skin crawl. She'd been traveling for 2 days, bouncing along roads that grew progressively worse as civilization thinned behind her. The final 30 miles had been nothing but rocky paths through moorland that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, broken only by skeletal trees that clawed at the gray sky. Her maid, Alice, sat across from her looking equally miserable. The girl was only 19, plucked from Lillian's family estate to accompany her into what both of them suspected was exile disguised as matrimony. "Miss Hawke, Your Grace," Alice corrected herself, though the title sounded absurd when applied to Lillian. What should I call you now?" "Lillian is fine when we're alone," she said quietly. "I don't feel much like a duchess." "You look like one," Alice offered, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Lillian. The dress had been her mother's attempt at armor, deep emerald silk with intricate beadwork that had taken 3 seamstresses a month to complete. It was beautiful and completely impractical for the wilderness she was entering. Lillian had wanted something simpler, but her mother had insisted. "You must make an impression. You must look worthy of a duke." Worthy. As if Lillian's worth could be measured in silk threads and seed pearls. The carriage lurched forward again, passing through the gates into what should have been manicured grounds. Instead, the estate looked like nature had been waging a slow war against human habitation and was winning. Overgrown hedges blocked entire pathways. What might have once been formal gardens now resembled wild meadows. Stone statues were so covered in moss and lichen they'd become abstract shapes. "Lord above," Alice whispered. "It's like something from a ghost story." Lillian couldn't disagree. The manor itself emerged from the gloom like a massive creature crouching on the landscape. It was built from dark gray stone that seemed to absorb what little light penetrated the cloud cover. 3 stories tall with too many windows, most of them dark, some actually broken. 2 wings extended from the main building at odd angles, as if the architect had changed his mind halfway through construction and never bothered to fix the mistake. The carriage stopped in front of broad stone steps leading to an entrance framed by columns that had seen better centuries. No one came out to greet them. No footman rushed forward. No housekeeper appeared with a welcoming smile. Just silence and the sound of wind moving through empty spaces. The driver, a local man who'd been paid extra to make the journey, climbed down and opened their door. He wouldn't meet Lillian's eyes. "This is as far as I go, miss. Your trunks will be brought up shortly." He practically threw the words at her before retreating to his perch. Lillian gathered her skirts and descended, her boots sinking slightly into gravel that hadn't been properly maintained. Alice followed, clutching her small bag like it might shield her from whatever awaited inside. The front door was massive, dark oak reinforced with iron bands that had oxidized to a deep rust color. Before Lillian could decide whether to knock or simply try the handle, it swung inward with a groan that echoed through what sounded like a cavernous interior. A man stood there, elderly and gaunt, dressed in black that might have been fashionable 20 years ago. His face was all sharp angles and deep lines, his white hair pulled back severely. He looked at Lillian with an expression that managed to convey both judgment and complete disinterest. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, as if the name tasted unpleasant. "I am Graves. I manage the household. Not welcome, not pleased to meet you. Just a statement of fact delivered in a tone that suggested her arrival was an inconvenience he was obligated to tolerate." "Mr. Graves," Lillian replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This is my maid, Alice. Our trunks will be delivered to your rooms." He stepped aside, a minimal gesture of entry. "His Grace is not available at present. You will be shown to your quarters." Lillian entered what she realized was not actually the main hall, but rather an antechamber that fed into the true entrance. The space was dim, lit by a few scattered candles that did more to create shadows than dispel them. The air smelled of dust and something else. Damp, maybe, or just the accumulated scent of a house that had been breathing its own air for too long. The main hall beyond was larger than her family's entire ground floor. A grand staircase split into two ascending curves, but the left side was roped off with a chain, as if that entire wing was forbidden. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashford staring down with varying degrees of disapproval. The most recent one showed a family of 4, a stern man, a beautiful woman, and 2 boys. One of the boys had dark hair and eyes that seemed to follow you. The other was lighter, with a smile that even paint couldn't quite capture. "The late Duke and Duchess," Graves said without being asked, noticing where Lillian's gaze had landed. "They passed 11 years ago. Cholera." "And the boys?" Something shifted in Graves's expression, though calling it emotion would be generous. "His Grace will discuss family matters if and when he chooses. This way." He led them up the right staircase, their footsteps echoing on marble that had lost its polish. The second floor was a maze of corridors lined with closed doors. Some had clearly not been opened in years, judging by the dust visible beneath them. Others were maintained but still gave off an air of emptiness. Graves stopped at a door near the middle of the corridor. "Your chambers, Mrs. Ashford. Your maid will be housed in the adjoining servants' room." He produced a key and unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal Lillian had expected something grim, but the room actually took her breath away. It was enormous, with tall windows that would have flooded the space with light on a sunny day. The furniture was elegant, if slightly outdated: a 4-poster bed with deep blue curtains, a writing desk positioned to catch the window light, several armchairs arranged around a fireplace where a fire was actually burning. Someone had prepared for her arrival, even if the welcome had been cold. "Your things will arrive within the hour," Graves said. "Dinner is served at 7 in the small dining room. His Grace may or may not attend. You are not to wander the estate unaccompanied." "Excuse me?" Lillian turned to face him fully. "I'm not a prisoner." "No, Mrs. Ashford. You are the Duchess of a very old estate with very old dangers. The East Wing is structurally unsound. The mines to the north are unstable and abandoned. The woods contain wildlife that can be aggressive. His Grace insists that guests unfamiliar with the property be accompanied for their own safety." The way he said guests made it clear he didn't quite consider her a permanent resident yet. Or perhaps he was being deliberately ambiguous about whether she ever would be. "Where's my husband?" Lillian asked bluntly. "His Grace keeps irregular hours. He will make himself available when appropriate." "It's our wedding day." For the first time, something almost human flickered across Graves's face. It might have been pity. "His Grace is aware of the calendar, Mrs. Ashford. Good afternoon." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the corridor with an efficiency that suggested he'd spent years perfecting the art of strategic retreat. Alice closed the door and sagged against it. "Miss Lillian, what have we gotten ourselves into?" "I don't know," Lillian admitted, moving to the window. From this height, she could see more of the estate, the overgrown gardens extending into wilderness, a lake in the distance that looked black under the gray sky, and beyond that, the dark shapes of what might be old mine structures jutting up like broken teeth. "But we're here now. We make the best of it." "The best of what? A husband who won't even greet his own bride? A house that looks like it's been abandoned? That man Graves treats you like an inconvenient delivery." "Alice." Lillian's tone was sharper than intended. She softened it. "I know, but panic won't help. Let's get unpacked, learn the layout, figure out what we're actually dealing with. Then we can decide what to do." What she couldn't say, was that there was no what to do beyond adapt. Her father had made the arrangement, the marriage contract was signed, and the ceremony had been performed by proxy 2 weeks ago in a London church where Lillian had stood alone at the altar while a legal representative had spoken her husband's vows. She was married to Duke Rowan Ashford, whether he deigned to acknowledge her or not. The trunks arrived as promised, carried by 2 servants who looked as worn as the furniture, a middle-aged man missing part of his left hand and a younger woman with a severe limp. They worked in complete silence, not even making eye contact, and were gone before Lillian could thank them. "Everyone here seems half dead," Alice muttered, unpacking one of the smaller cases. Like they're all just going through motions. Lillian didn't respond because she was thinking the same thing. The estate felt less like a functioning household and more like a stage where actors had been performing the same play so long they'd forgotten it was supposed to mean something. She spent the next hour exploring her rooms, and they were rooms, plural. Beyond the bedroom was a sitting area with more comfortable furniture, then a dressing room with empty wardrobes waiting to be filled, and finally a bathroom that actually had modern plumbing. Someone had invested in updates, even if they'd neglected the grounds. In the dressing room, she found something unexpected. A full-length mirror with an ornate frame, and tucked into the corner of the frame, a small photograph. It showed a young woman, maybe 20, with dark hair and a gentle smile. She was sitting in a garden somewhere, flowers blooming around her, and she looked genuinely happy. "Alice, do you recognize this woman?" Her maid came over and studied the photograph. "No, miss, but she's beautiful. Might be one of the family?" Lillian carefully removed the photograph and turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, "Catherine, spring 1839. 6 years ago." And whoever Catherine was, she'd been here and apparently happy enough to sit for a photograph in those gardens that were now overrun with weeds. She replaced the photograph and tried not to think about what had happened in 6 years to transform this place from somewhere that produced smiling pictures to what it was now. At precisely 7 o'clock, there was a knock on her door. The young woman with the limp stood there, eyes downcast. "Dinner, Your Grace. I'm to escort you." "What's your name?" Lillian asked. The woman looked surprised by the question. "Mary, Your Grace?" "Thank you, Mary. Lead the way." The small dining room turned out to be on the first floor, down a different corridor than the main hall. It was actually intimate. A table that could seat 8 but was currently set for 1. 1, not 2. Her husband wasn't even pretending he might join her. The meal was surprisingly good. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables that must have come from some kitchen garden she hadn't seen, bread that was still warm. But Lillian barely tasted it. She ate alone in silence while Mary stood by the door, presumably waiting to clear plates. "Mary, has His Grace eaten?" Lillian finally asked. "His Grace doesn't keep regular meal times, Your Grace. Cook prepares food and it's taken to his study when he requests it." "Where is his study?" Mary hesitated. "The 3rd floor, Your Grace. The tower room. But I'm not to wander unaccompanied." "Yes, I've been told." Lillian set down her fork. "Mary, how long have you worked here?" 5 years, Your Grace." "And in those 5 years, have there been other guests? Other women?" Mary's face flushed. "No, Your Grace. You're the first. Well, you're the Duchess. There hasn't been anyone else." Lillian let that sink in. 5 years of isolation. 11 since his parents died. And somewhere in between, the tragedy with his brother that had turned him into a recluse. She finished her meal in silence and returned to her rooms. Alice had turned down the bed and was waiting with a nightgown. "Did you see him?" she asked hopefully. "No." "Lillian, this is madness. You can't just be locked away in these rooms like property waiting to be claimed." "I'm not locked away. I just haven't figured out the rules yet." Lillian moved to the window. Night had fallen completely, and the darkness outside was absolute. No lights from nearby towns, no moon visible through the clouds. Just blackness punctuated occasionally by what might have been lights in the woods. Lanterns? Eyes? She couldn't tell. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "Tomorrow I'll start figuring this out. Where things are. Who these people are. What happened to make everyone so afraid?" "You think they're afraid?" Lillian thought about Graves's controlled movements, Mary's downcast eyes, the way the servants had hurried through their tasks as if trying to be invisible. "I think everyone here is terrified of something, and until I know what, I can't know how to survive it." She slept poorly that night. The bed was comfortable, but the silence was oppressive. None of the familiar sounds of a normal household. No footsteps in corridors, no distant voices, no creaking of a building settling into rest. Just wind, and occasionally a sound that might have been an animal or might have been something else entirely. At some point past midnight, she woke to the distinct sound of boots on gravel. She moved to the window and looked down to see a figure crossing the courtyard, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with purpose toward the stables. He carried a lantern that illuminated his face for just a moment. Strong features, dark hair, and an expression of such focused intensity that it was almost frightening. Her husband, Duke Rowan Ashford, who had married her by proxy and couldn't be bothered to greet her in person, was apparently leaving the estate in the middle of the night. She watched him saddle a horse, doing it himself rather than waking any servants, and ride out through the gates into that absolute darkness. Lillian stood at the window long after the light from his lantern had disappeared, trying to reconcile the stories she'd heard with the man she'd glimpsed. Dangerous, cold, heartless. The rumors had painted him as almost inhuman, but the man she'd seen moved like someone with weight on his shoulders, not emptiness in his chest. There was something deliberate about him, purposeful. Not the randomness of cruelty, but the precision of control. She returned to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, she lay there making plans. Tomorrow she would explore what she was allowed to explore. She would talk to the servants who seemed willing to talk. She would figure out the patterns of this broken household. And somehow, eventually, she would meet the man she'd married. Not as a timid bride waiting to be acknowledged, but as an equal demanding recognition. Because Lillian Ashford now, had not survived her father's gambling debts, her mother's social desperation, and 2 days of brutal travel to simply fade into the walls of this decaying manor. If she was going to be trapped here, she would at least understand her cage. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the key to open it. The sun rose late over the moorlands, if you could call the grudging gray light that filtered through persistent clouds sunrise. Lillian was already awake and dressed, having chosen the most practical gown she owned, a simple wool dress in deep gray that wouldn't show dirt and wouldn't tangle if she needed to move quickly. Alice had protested. "You're a duchess. You should look like one." "I'm a woman in a strange house who needs to learn her way around," Lillian had countered. "I'll save the silk for when there's someone to see it." Breakfast was brought to her rooms by Mary, who seemed surprised when Lillian invited her to sit and talk. "Oh, I couldn't, Your Grace. It wouldn't be proper." "Mary, I'm asking you to help me understand this place. That seems perfectly proper to me." The girl hesitated, then perched on the very edge of a chair as if ready to bolt at any moment. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Start with the house. How many servants are there?" 7 of us now, Your Grace. Used to be 23 before—" She stopped abruptly. "Before what?" "Before the old Duke and Duchess passed, and then after Master Julian." She trailed off, looking genuinely distressed. "Julian was His Grace's brother?" Mary nodded. "The younger one. Sweet boy, always laughing. He was supposed to go away to school, but he wanted to stay, help with the estate. He loved the mines, used to go down with the workers, learn the business." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Then there was the accident. Cave-in. They got most of the men out, but Julian and 3 others were trapped. His Grace went in after them, but the supports were failing and—" She stopped, tears forming. "They pulled His Grace out unconscious. The whole section collapsed. Julian and the others, they never found all the bodies." Lillian felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How old was Julian?" 16. Just 16. The same age as Lillian's youngest brother. She thought about what that loss would do to a family, to a person, to come so close to saving someone and fail. "That's when His Grace changed," Mary continued. "Before, he was stern but fair, involved in the estate, in the community. After, he shut down the mines, dismissed most of the staff, stopped going to town. Mr. Graves says he blames himself, that he can't forgive what happened." "And what do you think?" Mary looked startled by the question, as if her opinion had never been requested before. I think he's trying to make sure no one else gets hurt. Every rule, every restriction, it's all about safety. Don't go in the East Wing because the floors are rotting. Don't go near the mines because they're still unstable. Don't ride alone because there are old mine shafts hidden in the brush." She met Lillian's eyes directly for the first time. "Everyone thinks he's cruel, but maybe he's just scared." It was the most insightful thing anyone had said since Lillian arrived, and it came from a girl who limped through her duties and kept her eyes down. "How did you hurt your leg, Mary?" "Fell down the servant stairs 3 years ago. Broke in 2 places. His Grace brought the doctor from town himself, paid for everything, made sure I kept my position even though I couldn't work for months." She touched her leg unconsciously. "He's not cruel, Your Grace. He's just broken, and he doesn't know how to fix it." After Mary left, Lillian stood at her window looking out at the wild landscape and thought about broken men in broken houses trying to protect everyone by pushing them away. She'd come here expecting a monster. But monsters were simple. You fought them or fled them. Broken people were complicated. They had reasons, histories, pain that made sense if you could just get close enough to see it. And Lillian was good at seeing things others missed. It was why her father had always sent her to negotiate with creditors, why her mother had relied on her to smooth over social disasters. She could read people, find the truth beneath performance. So maybe that's what she would do here. Read the truth of Duke Rowan Ashford and figure out if the broken man could be reached, or if she was simply fooling herself to make her prison more bearable. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere between the two. But she wouldn't find it sitting in these rooms no matter how comfortable they were. "Alice," she called, "I'm going to explore the grounds. You can come or stay, but I'm not waiting for an escort." "Lillian, they can forbid me or they can accept it, but I won't be a ghost in my own home." She walked out before Alice could argue, before she could second-guess herself. Down the stairs, through the main hall where those painted eyes seemed to track her movement, and out the front door into air that was cold and damp but gloriously fresh after the stale atmosphere inside. The courtyard where she'd seen her husband last night looked different in daylight, still neglected but less ominous. She could see where formal paths had once run, where flower beds had been carefully planned. Nature had reclaimed most of it, but the bones of something beautiful remained. She walked toward the stables, half expecting someone to stop her. But no one appeared. The building was larger than it needed to be for the few horses she could hear inside. Most of the stalls were empty, cleaned but unused. "Looking for something, Your Grace?" Lillian turned to find a man in his 40s watching her from the tackroom door. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, and unlike the household servants, he met her gaze directly. "Just exploring," she said. "You are?" "Thomas, stable master, groundskeeper, and general handler of anything His Grace needs handled." He said it without bitterness, just stating facts. "You ride?" "Yes." "Well, His Grace keeps good horses. You're welcome to any of them except Grayson. That's his personal mount. Big gray stallion, you'll know him by temperament. He doesn't like anyone but His Grace." "Where does His Grace ride to?" The question was out before she could stop it. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. The old estate boundaries, the mines, the places he goes when the memories get too loud. It was such a direct answer, so different from Graves's evasions, that Lillian was momentarily speechless. "You loved Master Julian," she guessed. "I taught both boys to ride, taught them to track, to survive on the moors. Julian was like sunshine, always bright. His Grace was more serious, but kind." Thomas looked past her toward the house. When Julian died, part of His Grace died too, the part that believed he could protect people. Now he just tries to control everything, because control feels safer than trust. And yet he married. His solicitors married him, arranged the whole thing while he was in London on business, came home to find contracts signed and a wedding date set. Thomas's tone was carefully neutral. He didn't fight it, though. Signed the papers, went through with the ceremony by proxy. I think part of him knows he can't hide forever. Lillian processed this. Her marriage hadn't just been arranged without her input, it had been arranged without her husband's too. Two people manipulated into a union neither had chosen, expected to somehow build a life together. No wonder he hadn't greeted her. He probably resented her existence. "Thomas, where are the mines?" He pointed north toward those dark structures she'd seen from her window. "About 2 miles that way. But Your Grace, I know. Dangerous, unstable, forbidden. I'm not going today. I just wanted to orient myself." "Good." He studied her for a moment. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone easier to frighten. But you've got steel in you. You'll need it if you're going to survive this place." He said it like a compliment. "His Grace rides out at dawn most days, returns by late afternoon. Evenings he's in his study. If you want to catch him, dinner might work, but you'd have to insist. He'll avoid it if you don't." "Why are you helping me?" Thomas's face softened. "Because this house has been dying for 8 years. Maybe new life is what it needs. Maybe you're what he needs, even if he doesn't know it yet." Lillian spent the rest of the morning walking the grounds with Alice, who'd finally caught up and was determinedly staying close. They found the kitchen gardens, smaller than they should be but meticulously maintained. An elderly man working there nodded to them but didn't speak. They found the lake, which was actually beautiful despite the gray sky, dark water reflecting clouds, reeds along the edges moving in wind. There was a small dock with a rowboat tied to it, both in good repair. They found the boundary of the east wing, marked with ropes and warning signs about structural damage. Through windows, Lillian could see furniture covered in sheets, paintings turned to face walls. And they found the family cemetery, a small plot enclosed by iron fencing. Most of the stones were old, dates going back 200 years, but 3 were newer. The Duke and Duchess died 1834. And between them, a smaller stone, Julian Ashford, beloved son and brother, 1830 to 1846. Gone but never forgotten. Someone had been here recently. Fresh flowers lay on Julian's grave, wild flowers from the moors, already wilting but clearly placed with care. Her husband, Lillian realized, coming here in the middle of the night to leave flowers for a brother who'd been gone for 8 years. She thought about Thomas's words, the part that believed he could protect people. Standing there in that cold cemetery, Lillian made a decision. She couldn't fix the past. She couldn't bring back the dead or undo tragedy. But she could refuse to be another ghost in this house of ghosts. Tonight, she would insist on dinner with her husband. And Duke Rowan Ashford would have to decide whether he was going to acknowledge his wife or confirm that he was exactly the coward everyone whispered he'd become. Either way, the silence would end, because Lillian had not come this far to be invisible. The war, she thought, starts now. Lillian returned to the house with mud on her boots and purpose in her stride. Alice trailed behind, alternating between excitement and anxiety about what her mistress was planning. The main hall was empty except for the ever-present portraits, but Lillian could feel eyes watching from somewhere. Servants had a way of knowing everything that happened in a house, especially one as isolated as this. She found Graves in what appeared to be his office, a cramped room off the main corridor filled with ledgers and correspondence. He looked up when she entered without knocking, his expression flickering between annoyance and something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Ashford, I trust you enjoyed your walk." "I did, and I'll be dining with my husband tonight. In the main dining room, not that closet I was put in yesterday." Graves set down his pen with deliberate care. "His Grace does not take meals in the main dining room." "Then tonight will be a new experience for him. 7 o'clock. I expect the room properly prepared and both our places set." She kept her voice level but firm. "You can tell him it's a request if that makes it easier, but it's happening." "Mrs. Ashford, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Graves. I understand that this house has been operating under rules designed to keep everyone separate and safe. But I'm not one of your frightened servants. I'm the Duchess, whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not, and I will have dinner with my husband." She turned and left before he could respond, her heart hammering. That had been a gamble, asserting authority she wasn't sure she possessed over a household that didn't recognize her right to it. But backing down now would establish a pattern she couldn't afford. Alice caught up with her on the stairs. "Lillian, what if he doesn't come? Then I eat alone in a bigger room and make the same demand tomorrow. And the next day, until he either appears or physically bars me from the dining room." She reached her chambers and sank into a chair, adrenaline making her hands shake slightly. "I won't be ignored, Alice. I refuse. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both." She spent the afternoon preparing with more care than she'd given any social event back in London. The deep blue silk dress that made her eyes look darker, her hair arranged in a style that was elegant but not trying too hard. She wanted to look like someone who belonged at a duke's table, someone worth acknowledging. At 6:45, she descended the stairs to find the main dining room transformed. Someone, probably several someones working frantically, had cleaned and polished until the long mahogany table gleamed. Candelabras were lit, casting warm light that almost made the cavernous space feel intimate. 2 places were set at one end of the table, close enough for conversation, but not uncomfortably so. And standing by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds, was her husband. He was taller than she'd realized from her glimpse the night before, easily over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from physical labor rather than leisure. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar in a way that suggested he'd stopped caring about fashion. He wore simple clothing, dark trousers, white shirt, no jacket or cravat. Dressed for his study, not for dinner with his wife. He didn't turn when she entered. For a moment, Lillian considered speaking first, but something told her to wait. Let him make the choice to acknowledge her presence. The silence stretched. She could hear the candles burning, the wind outside, her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Finally, he spoke without turning. "You've put Graves in a difficult position." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by lack of use. It carried the educated accent of his class, but with something else underneath, a weariness that sounded bone deep. "Mr. Graves will survive the inconvenience," Lillian replied. "He informed me you explored the grounds today, against explicit instructions." "I walked my own property. That's hardly rebellion. Everything beyond these walls is dangerous." Now he did turn, and Lillian got her first real look at Duke Rowan Ashford. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too angular, too marked by experience. There was a scar along his left jawline, faded but visible. His eyes were dark. Not brown, but the kind of deep gray that looked black in certain lights, and they held an intensity that was almost physical. He looked like a man who'd stopped sleeping properly years ago and had forgotten how to start again. But there was something compelling about him despite the severity, or maybe because of it. He looked real in a way the polished gentleman of London society never had, like someone who'd been tested and broken and rebuilt himself into something harder. "I was accompanied," Lillian said, "and I spoke to your staff, Mary, Thomas. They were helpful." Something flashed across his face at Thomas's name. "Thomas talks too much." Thomas answered my questions honestly. I appreciated it. "And what did you learn from these honest answers?" He moved toward the table but didn't sit. "That I'm a recluse, a madman? That I let my brother die and now I'm slowly killing this estate through neglect?" The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Lillian held her ground. "I learned that you're afraid, that you've turned fear into control, because it's the only thing that makes sense to you anymore." His eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me. I know you leave flowers on your brother's grave in the middle of the night. I know you updated the plumbing in the house but let the gardens go wild. I know you dismiss servants not because you're cruel, but because you couldn't bear the responsibility of more lives depending on you." She took a step closer. "I know you didn't want this marriage any more than I did, but you went through with it anyway, and I'd like to know why." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then he pulled out a chair and sat, a gesture that seemed to cost him effort. "My solicitors believe an heir is necessary for the estate's future. The title must continue. This is a practical arrangement, nothing more." "Then let's be practical." Lillian sat across from him, smoothing her skirts. "We're married. Neither of us can change that. We can make each other miserable by pretending the other doesn't exist, or we can establish some kind of working relationship. I don't expect affection. I don't expect romance. But I do expect basic courtesy." Graves appeared with the first course, soup that smelled of herbs and cream. He served them both in silence, his face carefully neutral, and retreated. Rowan picked up his spoon, then set it down again. "You should know what you've married into. This estate is failing. The mines are closed, the tenants are leaving, the income barely covers maintenance. I can provide you with a roof and meals, but don't expect luxury." "I didn't come here for luxury." "Then what did you come here for?" The question hung between them, honest and stark. Lillian considered several diplomatic answers before deciding on truth. "I didn't have a choice. My father gambled away our fortune. Marrying well was the only way to save my family from ruin. Your solicitors made a generous offer. My father accepted before I even knew about it." She met his eyes. "So we're both victims of other people's decisions. That doesn't mean we have to be enemies." He looked at her with something that might have been surprise, or might have been reassessment. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone more fragile. The kind of woman who'd take one look at this place and demand to be sent back to London." "Would you have sent me?" "Probably." He finally tasted the soup. "This is actually good. Who's cooking?" "Mrs. Hall, I believe. She seems competent despite having a kitchen staff of 1. 2 now. She requested an assistant last week. I approved it." He said it like admitting a weakness. Small concessions, trying to keep the place from completely falling apart. Why not hire more staff, open more of the house? His jaw tightened. Because more people means more risk, more lives I'm responsible for, more chances for something to go wrong. You can't prevent every disaster. I couldn't prevent the one that mattered. The words came out harsh. Then he seemed to catch himself. Julian was my responsibility. My parents were dead. He was 16 and wanted to learn the family business. I said yes because I thought... He stopped, jaw working. I thought I could protect him. I was wrong. Lillian let the silence settle before speaking. Thomas told me you went into the mine after him, that they pulled you out unconscious. Thomas definitely talks too much. You tried to save him. Trying doesn't matter. Results matter. He's dead. 3 miners are dead, and I'm here having soup with a stranger I married because my solicitors think continuing the family line is more important than the fact that I can barely manage my own life, let alone someone else's. It should have stung, being called a stranger, but Lillian heard the truth underneath. He wasn't being cruel, he was being honest about his own limitations in a way that was almost painful to witness. So what do we do? She asked quietly. Live in the same house but never speak? Pass each other in hallways like ghosts? Produce an heir through sheer force of obligation and then go back to our separate existences? That was approximately the plan, yes. That's a terrible plan. For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Do you have a better one? We start with dinners. Once a week to start, if daily is too much. We talk about neutral things, the estate, the weather, books we've read. We establish basic familiarity. Then we see what's possible from there. And if nothing is possible, then at least we tried. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to love me, Rowan. I'm asking you not to bury me alive in this house alongside your grief. The use of his first name made him flinch slightly, but he didn't correct her. He finished his soup in silence while Graves brought the next course, roasted lamb with potatoes and carrots. The meal continued in fits and starts of conversation. Safe topics. The condition of the tenant farms, most of which were being managed by the tenants themselves since Rowan had stopped active oversight. The library, which he confirmed she was welcome to use. The horses, which Thomas had already offered her access to. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. 2 people trying to navigate an impossible situation without pretense. Near the end of the meal, Rowan said abruptly, "The East Wing is truly dangerous. The structural damage is extensive. I'm not exaggerating to keep you confined." I believe you. What happened to it? Fire. 10 years ago, before my parents died. They were trying to modernize, installed new heating systems. Something went wrong. We got everyone out, but the damage was too extensive to repair properly. I've been meaning to have it torn down, but... He trailed off. But that would mean letting go of another piece of the past. His expression went carefully blank. Perhaps. Graves cleared their plates. Rowan stood, clearly intending to retreat. Once a week, Lillian reminded him. That was the agreement. I didn't agree to anything. But you will. Because despite everything, you're not actually a coward. You're just scared. And there's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment, that intense gaze trying to read her the way she was reading him. You're very certain of yourself. I'm not certain of anything, but I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, so we might as well figure out how to exist in the same space. Next week then. Wednesday. Same time. He said it grudgingly, but he said it. I'll see you then. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Lillian sat alone at the long table, feeling simultaneously triumphant and exhausted. It wasn't much. One dinner, one agreement to meet again, but it was something, a crack in the walls he'd built. Alice found her still sitting there 20 minutes later. Well, it's a start, Lillian said. Possibly a terrible start, but a start nonetheless. Over the next week, Lillian established her own routines. Morning walks with Alice, exploring more of the estate and slowly mapping its geography in her mind. Afternoons in the library, which turned out to be extensive and surprisingly well-maintained. Rowan might have abandoned social niceties, but he clearly still read voraciously. She found recent volumes on engineering, agriculture, even poetry. His tastes were eclectic. She also began talking to the other servants, learning names and stories. Mrs. Hall, the cook, who'd worked here since she was 15 and remembered when the house was full of laughter. James, the man with the missing hand, who'd lost it in the same mind collapse that killed Julian and stayed on anyway because, as he put it, his grace paid for the best doctors and didn't dismiss me when I couldn't work for months. Loyalty means something. Each conversation added depth to her understanding of the man she'd married. He was capable of kindness when he allowed himself to be. But he'd erected such barriers that most people never got close enough to witness it. The second Wednesday came. Dinner was less awkward than the first, though still formal. Rowan was marginally more talkative, asking about her family, her life in London. She told him about her brothers, 3 of them, all younger, all dependent on her father's bad decisions. She told him about learning to manage household accounts because her mother couldn't face the creditors. She didn't make herself sound heroic, just practical. Survival required pragmatism. Your family sent you into this arrangement knowing you'd hate it, Rowan observed. They sent me into it hoping I'd survive it. There's a difference, she paused. Would you have preferred a wife who was excited about marrying a reclusive duke? Someone who'd show up with expectations of romance and transformation? I'd prefer no wife at all, but if I must have one, I suppose someone practical is better than someone delusional. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. Just more honesty. The third Wednesday, it rained, a violent storm that came howling across the moors with wind that rattled windows and rain that hit the glass like thrown gravel. Lillian arrived at dinner to find Rowan already there, standing at the window and watching the storm with an expression she couldn't read. My parents died in weather like this, he said without preamble. Carriage overturned on the road to town. The driver survived. They didn't. Lillian moved to stand beside him. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. But his voice lacked bite. He just sounded tired. Julian took their deaths hard. Started having nightmares. Didn't want to leave the estate. The mine work was his way of feeling useful, of being part of something. I thought it would help him heal. You couldn't have known what would happen. I knew the mines were dangerous. Every mine is dangerous. I knew, and I let him go anyway because I thought... He stopped, jaw clenching. It doesn't matter what I thought. They stood in silence, watching the storm. Finally, Lillian said, Do you ever talk about him? About what happened? No? Maybe that's the problem. He turned to look at her, expression hardening. Don't I? Don't what? Point out that you've been carrying this alone for 8 years and it's destroying you? You don't know what you're talking about. I know that guilt only grows in silence. I know that pretending the past doesn't exist doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes the hurt last longer. She kept her voice gentle but firm. I know because I've done it. When my mother lost our last baby, I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, managed better, was more useful, it would fill the hole. It didn't. It just made me exhausted. This isn't the same. No. Your tragedy is worse. But the principle is the same. You're trying to carry something that's too heavy alone. He turned away from the window, moving toward the table with rigid movements. We should eat before the food gets cold. It was a clear dismissal of the topic, but Lillian let it go. Pushing too hard too fast would just make him retreat further. Dinner proceeded tensely. Rowan was more closed off than he'd been in previous weeks, answering in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact. But he didn't leave early. He stayed through the entire meal, even accepting coffee afterward. A first. I've been thinking about the estate, Lillian said carefully. The tenant farms. Some of them are struggling without proper oversight. They manage. They survive. There's a difference. What if I started doing visits, not official business, just checking in, learning who they are, what they need? He frowned. That would require you to travel across the estate unaccompanied. Thomas could escort me, or one of the other men. Thomas has enough responsibilities. Then hire someone else. Hire back some of the staff you dismissed. This place is dying, Rowan. Not quickly, but steadily. And it doesn't have to. You've been here less than a month and you're already trying to restructure everything? I'm trying to be useful. I'm trying to do something besides sit in beautiful rooms and wait for my life to happen around me. Her frustration leaked through. You want a practical wife? Let me be practical. Let me help. I don't need help. Everyone needs help. You've just convinced yourself that needing it is weakness. His hand tightened on his coffee cup. You're very free with your observations about my character. Someone should be. Everyone else tiptoes around you like you're made of glass. She leaned forward. I'm not afraid of you, Rowan. I'm afraid of wasting my life in a house where nothing grows, nothing changes, nothing lives. I didn't come here to be comfortable. I came because I had no choice. But now that I'm here, I refuse to just exist. I want to matter." The silence that followed was charged. Rowan stared at her with an expression caught between anger and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "You matter," he said finally, quietly. "Whether you do anything or not. You matter because you're here, and you're real, and you're not." He stopped abruptly. "I'll consider your proposal about the tenant visits. But not alone. Never alone. This land is too dangerous." It was an agreement, but it was close enough. Lillian nodded. The fourth Wednesday, Rowan didn't show up to dinner. Lillian waited until 8 o'clock before sending Alice to find out what happened. She returned looking worried. "Graves says His Grace left this morning for the mines and hasn't returned. There's talk of sending a search party." Fear shot through Lillian, sharp and immediate. "Why would he go to the mines?" "No one knows, but it's the anniversary." Alice stopped. "The anniversary of what?" "The collapse. It was 8 years ago today." Lillian was moving before she'd consciously decided to. Down the stairs, through the hall, finding Graves in his office. "Where exactly are the mines?" "Mrs. Ashford, please. Where are they?" Graves looked at her for a long moment, then pulled out a map. "Here, about 2 miles north-northeast. But you cannot possibly be thinking. Send for Thomas. Tell him to saddle 2 horses. Fast ones." "Mrs. Ashford, it's getting dark. There's another storm coming in. Then we need to hurry. Either help me or get out of my way." She didn't wait for his response. She ran back to her rooms and changed into her riding habit, the most practical clothing she owned. Alice tried to stop her, but Lillian was beyond listening to reason. Thomas met her at the stables, already saddling a sturdy mare. He handed her the reins without question. "You know where we're going?" he asked. "The mines. And Thomas, thank you for not trying to stop me. Wouldn't work anyway. Besides, if anyone can talk him out of whatever dark place he's gone to, it might be you." He swung onto his own horse. "But Mrs. Ashford, those mines are unstable. If he's gone down inside, then we get him out. Let's go." They rode hard across the moors as the sun dropped below the horizon and the first drops of rain began to fall. The landscape was treacherous even in daylight. Hidden dips, scattered rocks, the occasional concealed shaft that could cripple a horse. In growing darkness with a storm building, it was nearly suicidal. Lillian didn't care. The image of Rowan alone in those mines on the anniversary of his brother's death drove her forward. She'd spent weeks learning to read him, understanding the depths of his guilt and pain. This wasn't just a visit to the site. This was something darker, something final. The rain intensified as they neared the mine structures. Skeletal wooden frames surrounding dark openings in the hillside. Most were boarded up, but one showed signs of recent disturbance. A horse was tied nearby. Grayson, the gray stallion Thomas had mentioned. "He went inside," Thomas said grimly. "Damn fool." They dismounted and Thomas grabbed a lantern from his saddlebag, lighting it with shaking hands. The rain was coming down in sheets now, thunder rolling across the sky. "Mrs. Ashford, you should wait here." "Not a chance." Lillian took the lantern. "Which way?" Thomas led her to the open shaft entrance. A tunnel sloped downward into darkness that seemed to swallow their small light. Water was already running down the slope, making the footing treacherous. "The collapse was about 300 feet in," Thomas said. "That's where they'll have sealed it off." "If he's gone that far—" A distant rumble interrupted him. Not thunder. Something underground. "The water," Thomas said, face going pale. "Heavy rain destabilizes the tunnels. We need to get him out now." They entered the mine. The darkness was absolute beyond their lantern light. The walls were rough stone and timber supports, many of them rotted or cracked. Water dripped from everywhere, and the air smelled of earth and decay. Their footsteps echoed strangely, making it sound like there were more than 2 people. "Rowan!" Lillian called. Her voice bounced back distorted. No answer. They moved deeper, the slope steepening. Thomas counted supports under his breath, keeping track of how far they'd gone. At support number 43, they found the barrier, rough wooden planks nailed across the tunnel, marked with warnings that had faded to illegibility. and sitting on the ground in front of it, soaked and staring at nothing, was Rowan. He didn't react to their arrival, just sat there with his back against the barrier, rain-soaked and hollow-eyed. "Rowan," Lillian said, kneeling beside him, "we need to leave. The tunnel's not safe." "He's right there," Rowan said quietly, "just on the other side of this barrier. Him and the others. They never recovered all the bodies. Too dangerous. So we just sealed them in and left them. Left him. There was nothing else you could do. I could have been faster. I got to the entry shaft. I went down. I got to the collapse point, but the supports were failing and they pulled me back. They pulled me back and Julian was right there. I could hear him calling for help and I couldn't." His voice broke. "I couldn't reach him." Another rumble, closer this time. The ground trembled slightly. "Rowan, we have to go. Now." Thomas's voice was urgent, but Rowan didn't move. "I come here every year, same day. I sit here and I try to remember what I could have done differently. There must have been something. Some choice I could have made that would have changed it." Lillian grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "There wasn't. You know there wasn't. You were 24 years old, and you tried to save your brother, and you nearly died doing it. That's the truth. Not that you failed, that you tried everything possible, and it still wasn't enough. Sometimes nothing is enough. Sometimes people die and it's not anyone's fault, and you just have to survive it." "I don't want to survive it anymore," he said, and the rawness in his voice was devastating. "I'm tired of surviving. I'm tired of this weight. I'm tired of waking up every day knowing he's dead because I wasn't good enough, fast enough, strong enough." The tunnel shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling. One of the support timbers cracked with a sound like a gunshot. "Move!" Thomas shouted. Lillian grabbed Rowan's arm and pulled. He was dead weight at first. Then something shifted and he was moving, stumbling to his feet. Thomas was already running back toward the entrance, lantern swinging wildly. Behind them, the barrier splintered. The collapse was continuing, eating into the tunnel they were in. They ran through darkness lit only by crazy lantern shadows, rain and debris falling around them. Rowan pulled ahead, his knowledge of the tunnel letting him navigate by memory. He grabbed Lillian's hand and pulled her forward as a support beam crashed down behind them. The entrance appeared, a gray square of stormlight that looked like salvation. They burst out into the rain just as a section of the tunnel roof caved in with a roar that sounded like the earth itself screaming. All three of them collapsed in the mud outside, breathing hard. The rain washed over them, cold and cleansing. Rowan rolled onto his back, staring up at the storm. Then he started laughing, a raw, broken sound that was part sob. "You could have died, both of you, because of my stupidity." "We didn't die," Lillian said, still trying to catch her breath. "We're all here. We're all breathing." He turned his head to look at her, rain streaming down his face. "Why did you come?" "Because you're my husband. Because, despite everything, I don't think you deserve to die alone in the dark. Because—" She stopped, surprised by her own truth. "Because I'm starting to care what happens to you, and that terrifies me almost as much as that tunnel did." Thomas tactfully stood and went to check on the horses, leaving them lying in the mud in the rain. Rowan reached out and took her hand. His grip was tight, desperate. "I don't know how to stop feeling this." "Maybe you don't stop it. Maybe you just learn to carry it differently, with help instead of alone." He didn't respond with words, just held her hand while the storm raged around them and the mine smoldered with fresh collapse behind them. And Lillian realized that something fundamental had shifted. They'd crossed some invisible line, from strangers forced together to two people who'd faced death and chosen each other's survival over their own safety. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was real and raw and infinitely more honest than anything she'd experienced in the careful performances of London society. When they finally rode back to the estate, both soaked and shaking, Graves met them at the door with blankets and hot tea and a lecture about responsibility that neither of them listened to. That night, for the first time, Rowan came to her door. Not for the traditional marital duty they'd both been avoiding, but just to stand there, water still dripping from his hair. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming after me, for refusing to let me drown in this." "We're partners in this disaster now," Lillian replied. "Whether we planned it or not, might as well keep each other breathing." He nodded, something almost like a smile ghosting across his face. "Wednesday dinners seem insufficient after tonight." "Probably. We'll figure it out as we go. He left, but something had fundamentally changed. The walls weren't down. Walls that thick don't fall in a day. But there were cracks now, places where light could get through. And Lillian stood at her window watching the storm finally break apart, revealing stars, and thought that maybe, just maybe, broken things could learn to work differently. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to keep breathing, keep moving forward, keep trying. It would have to be enough, because giving up wasn't an option anymore. Not for either of them. The days after the mine became something neither of them had words for. Not comfortable. Comfort was too simple a word for the charged silence that filled rooms when they passed each other. Not easy. Nothing about learning to exist in proximity to another damaged person was easy. But different. Undeniably, irrevocably different. Rowan stopped hiding. Not completely. He still disappeared for hours into his study, still rode out alone at dawn. But he started appearing at breakfast, started asking Lillian about her plans for the day instead of pretending she didn't exist, started looking at her like she was real instead of an inconvenient obligation. And Lillian, for her part, stopped asking permission. She began the tenant visits she'd proposed, taking Thomas or occasionally James as escort. The farms were in worse condition than she'd realized from a distance. Roofs needed repair, fences were falling apart, and more than one family was barely making it through on pride and stubbornness alone. "Why hasn't anyone told His Grace?" she asked Thomas during their third visit, standing in a barn where rain was actively leaking through holes in the roof. They tried, years ago. He sent money for repairs but never followed up, never visited himself. Eventually people stopped asking. Easier to manage on their own than feel like charity cases. Lillian made notes in the small journal she'd started carrying. Roof repairs, fencing materials, seeds for spring planting. The list grew longer with each visit. That evening she found Rowan in the library, a space she'd been using frequently but he'd been avoiding. He looked up when she entered, marked his page, and waited. "The tenant farms need significant investment," she said without preamble, setting her journal on the table between them. "Repairs, materials, in some cases complete rebuilding of structures. I've made a list with estimates." He picked up the journal, scanned her notes. His expression didn't change, but something tightened around his eyes. "This would cost more than we have in ready funds. Then we find the funds, sell something, take a loan. The estate can't generate income if the people working it can't survive. You've been here 6 weeks and you're already proposing I go into debt? I'm proposing you stop letting everything rot while you hide in this house feeling sorry for yourself." The words came out harsher than intended. Rowan's face went cold, the same shuttered expression he'd worn when she first arrived. "Careful, Lillian." "Why? You'll dismiss me? Send me away? We're married. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you, so we might as well deal with reality." She leaned forward. "These people have been loyal to your family for generations. They stayed even after the mine closed, even after you stopped managing the estate properly. They deserve better than slow abandonment." "I didn't abandon them." "Then what do you call it? Sending money and hoping problems solve themselves? That's not management, Rowan. That's guilt payments." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've spent the last 2 weeks visiting every farm on this estate. I've talked to people you haven't seen in years. Do you even know that the Harrises lost their oldest son last winter? That he died of pneumonia because they couldn't afford a doctor and were too proud to ask for help?" That stopped him. "What?" "Michael Harris, 17. He's buried in the village cemetery because they couldn't afford to transport the body to the family plot. His mother cried when she told me because she was ashamed that she'd let her son die rather than beg the Duke for charity." Lillian stood as well, facing him across the table. "That's what your isolation costs. Not just you, everyone who depends on this estate." "I didn't know, because you don't ask. Because it's easier to hide than face the fact that other people exist and need things from you." The silence that followed was brittle. Rowan's hands gripped the back of his chair hard enough that his knuckles went white. "What do you want me to do?" he finally asked, voice rough. "Come with me. Tomorrow. Visit the farms, see what I've seen, then decide if you can keep pretending none of it matters. And if I can't face it, then I'll do it alone. But I'd rather not. These people don't trust me yet. I'm too new, too much of an outsider." They need to see you. They need to know you still care about something besides your own pain. It was brutal honesty, and they both knew it. Rowan looked at her with something that might have been anger, or might have been respect, or might have been both tangled together. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "Early, before I can change my mind." They rode out at dawn with Thomas trailing at a respectful distance. The morning was cold and clear, frost crunching under the horses' hooves. Rowan hadn't been off estate property in months. Lillian could see the tension in how he held himself, the way his eyes scanned constantly for threats that didn't exist. Their first stop was the Harris farm. The widow who answered the door took one look at Rowan and burst into tears, not from fear, but from relief so profound it was painful to witness. "Your Grace," she managed, we all thought you'd forgotten us." "I'm sorry," Rowan said, and the rawness in his voice made Lillian's chest tight. "I'm so sorry about Michael. I didn't know." "How could you know? We didn't tell anyone. Too ashamed." Mrs. Harris wiped her eyes. "But you're here now. That means something." They spent an hour at the Harris farm. Rowan inspected the barn, noted the failing roof, asked questions about crop yields and winter stores. He was awkward at first, clearly out of practice with basic human interaction, but something in him seemed to wake up as they talked, some part that remembered how to be responsible for more than just his own survival. The next farm was the Blackwells, where the elderly couple managing 40 acres explained that their sons had left for factory work in Manchester because farming couldn't support families anymore. "We're the last generation here," Mr. Blackwell said matter-of-factly. "Once we're gone, this land goes back to wild. No one to inherit it, no one to work it." Rowan stared at the fields. Good land, fertile, just neglected. What if there were jobs here, real employment, not just tenant farming? Would your sons come back? Might, if there was reason to, but, Your Grace, the mines are closed. Not the mines. Something else. I don't know what yet, but something. He looked at Lillian. "We'll figure it out." It was the first time he'd said "we" like he meant it as partnership rather than obligation. They visited 6 farms that day. By the end of it, Rowan was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The weight of seeing what his isolation had cost was written across his face. On the ride back, he said quietly, "I didn't realize how much I'd let go, how much damage I'd done by doing nothing. Now you do. So what happens next?" "Next, I stop hiding. I hire back staff, proper staff. I start managing this estate like it matters, instead of treating it like a burden. He stopped. "I try to be the person these people deserve instead of the ghost I've been." That's a start. "Lillian." He pulled his horse to a halt, turning to face her directly. "Why do you care? About any of this? You could have stayed in your rooms, played the neglected wife, waited for your father's debts to be paid, and petitioned for a separation. Why push so hard?" She considered several diplomatic answers before settling on truth. "Because I can't stand waste. And you, this estate, these people, it's all going to waste because one tragedy 8 years ago convinced you that caring about anything was too dangerous. I don't accept that. I refuse to accept that one horrible thing gets to define everything that comes after." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, it's brutally hard, but it's necessary." She nudged her horse forward. "And you're not doing it alone anymore. Whether you like it or not, you're stuck with me. Might as well use that." That night at dinner, now a daily occurrence rather than weekly, Rowan laid out plans. Hire back household staff, bring in contractors for the tenant repairs, start researching alternative income sources for the estate. He talked faster than she'd ever heard him, ideas tumbling out like they'd been dammed up for years. "We could look into sheep," he said, gesturing with his fork in a way that was almost animated. "The moorland isn't good for crops, but it's perfect for grazing. Or timber. There are sections of woodland that could be harvested sustainably. Or—" "Rowan." He stopped mid-sentence. "What?" "Breathe. We don't have to solve everything tonight." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I'm not used to planning for a future that extends beyond next week. I've noticed. But we have time. Not unlimited time, but enough to be strategic instead of frantic." He nodded, setting down his fork. "I spoke with Graves this afternoon, placed advertisements for staff positions in the village and the nearby towns. We should have applicants within the week." "That's good. And I wrote to my solicitors in London. Ask them to research investment opportunities and market conditions. He paused. I also told them to begin transferring your portion of my income to an account in your name. You should have independent funds. Lillian blinked. That's not necessary. It is. You've been here almost 2 months without access to money of your own. That's unacceptable. His tone left no room for argument. You're not a prisoner. You shouldn't be financially dependent on my whims. It was such an unexpected gesture, so counter to everything society expected of marital relationships, that Lillian didn't know how to respond. Thank you, she finally managed. Don't thank me. It's basic decency. He stood, then hesitated. I'm going to check on something in the East Wing. You're welcome to join me if you'd like. It was an invitation, not a demand, not an obligation, an actual choice offered freely. Lillian stood. Lead the way. The East Wing was as damaged as Graves had warned. Rowan carried a lantern, navigating around charred floorboards and sections where the ceiling had collapsed entirely. The fire had gutted most of the interior, leaving skeletal frameworks and smoke-stained walls. This was the family wing, Rowan explained, his voice echoing in the empty space. My parents' rooms. The nursery Julian and I shared as children. All of it gone. They reached what might have been a bedroom. The walls were barely standing, open to the elements. Rain had warped what little furniture remained. I keep meaning to have it demolished, Rowan said, but every time I make the arrangements, I can't follow through. It feels like erasing them. My parents, Julian, everything we were before it all fell apart. Tearing down a building doesn't erase memory, doesn't it? Once it's gone, there's no physical reminder, just empty space where something used to be. Lillian moved to what had been a window, now just an opening in the wall. The view looked out over the lake, beautiful in the moonlight. My mother lost 4 babies before she finally stopped trying. 4 pregnancies that ended in stillbirths or deaths within days. She kept the nursery exactly as it was for years. Cradle, blankets, tiny clothes. She thought it honored them, but all it did was keep her trapped in grief. When she finally cleared it out, turned it into something else, that's when she could actually remember the babies without the memory destroying her. What did she turn it into? A sewing room. Something productive. Something that created instead of just preserving loss. Lillian turned back to face him. Maybe that's what this wing needs. Not demolition, transformation. Turn it into something that serves the living instead of embalming the dead. Rowan stared at the ruins around them. Like what? I don't know yet. But we could figure it out, together. The word together seemed to carry weight in the darkness. Rowan moved closer, close enough that she could see his expression in the lantern light, conflicted, wary, but also something else. Something that looked almost like hope. I'm not good at this, he said quietly, at letting people close, at trusting that they won't leave or die or disappear. I know. I'm not good at it either. I've spent my whole life managing other people's disasters, being useful, being necessary. I don't know how to just be with someone without purpose or transaction. Then we're both terrible at this. Absolutely terrible. He reached out and took her hand. A deliberate choice, not accidental contact. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold air. What if we fail at it? At this? At trying to be partners? Then we fail. But at least we tried. Lillian squeezed his hand. I'm tired of half living out of fear of failure, aren't you? Exhausted, he admitted. They stood there in the ruins of his family's past, holding hands like anchors keeping each other from drifting into separate darkness. It wasn't romance. It was rawer than that. 2 people who'd survived different disasters recognizing each other as fellow survivors. The moment broke when a sound echoed from deeper in the wing, a crash, then voices. Rowan's entire body went tense. Someone's in here. Could be animals. That was human. He pulled her back toward the entrance they'd come through. This wing is supposed to be secured. No one should be able to access it. Another crash, closer. Then light. Multiple lanterns moving through the damaged corridors. Your Grace, a voice called out. We know you're in here. Rowan's face went hard. Get behind me. Who is that? I don't know, but they're not supposed to be here. 3 men emerged from the darkness. Rough-looking, clearly not estate workers. The one in front was tall and heavy, with a scar running from eyebrow to jaw. He smiled when he saw Rowan, and it wasn't friendly. "Duke Ashford. Been a while." "Bexley." Rowan's voice was flat. "What are you doing on my property?" "Your property?" The man called Bexley laughed. "That's funny, seeing as you still owe my employer a considerable sum." "I owe your employer nothing. The debt was paid. Paid with land rights to the mine, which you then closed, making the rights worthless. My employer considers that breach of contract." Lillian's mind raced, trying to piece together what she was hearing. Rowan had debts tied to the mine, debts he'd thought were settled. "The contract specified land rights, not operational status," Rowan said carefully. "I fulfilled my obligation." "That's not how Mr. Carver sees it. And Mr. Carver wants his money, with interest. £50,000 by month's end, or he starts claiming assets, starting with this estate." £50,000. The sum made Lillian's stomach drop. That wasn't debt. That was destruction. "I don't have £50,000, Rowan said flatly. "Then you have a problem." Bexley's eyes shifted to Lillian. "Though I hear you've recently acquired a wife, with family connections in London. Maybe they'd be interested in helping out." "Leave her out of this." "Can't do that, Your Grace. This is business. And in business, all assets are on the table." He took a step closer. "Mr. Carver is a patient man, but his patience has limits. You closed those mines without consideration for how it affected his investments. Now you pay the price." "The mines were unsafe. Men died. Men die. That's not Mr. Carver's concern. His concern is profit, and you cost him a great deal of it." Rowan's hand was still gripping Lillian's, tight enough to hurt. She could feel the tension radiating through him, fury and fear, and something desperate. "1 month, Bexley said, £50,000, cash or assets of equivalent value. We'll be back to collect." "Oh, and Your Grace?" His smile widened. "Don't try to run. Mr. Carver has people watching, in the village, on the roads. You're not going anywhere until this is settled." The three men left the way they'd come, their lantern light fading back into darkness. Rowan and Lillian stood frozen until the sound of their footsteps disappeared entirely. Then Rowan released her hand and slammed his fist into the nearest wall, hard enough that his knuckles split. "Damn it! Damn it! Rowan, this is why I closed everything down, why I dismissed people, why I stopped managing the estate properly. Because I was trying to reduce expenses enough to keep the wolves from the door. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough. Tell me everything, from the beginning." He was pacing now, agitated. "My father took loans to modernize the estate, installed new equipment in the mines, updated the house. The lenders were legitimate at first, but when the interest rates became predatory, he shifted to alternative sources, including Carver, who operates on the edge of legality, loans with impossible terms secured against assets. The mine rights. Yes, but they were supposed to transfer ownership only if the mines closed permanently. I thought closing them temporarily while I secured them would protect the contract. I was wrong." "How wrong?" "Carver's lawyers found loopholes I didn't see. Or rather, I saw them and hoped they wouldn't matter. I've been fighting this for 3 years through legal channels, but I'm running out of options." He stopped pacing, looked at her with something approaching desperation. "I can't ask your family for help. Your father's financial situation is why you're here in the first place." "No, we can't go to them." Lillian's mind was racing through possibilities, all of them grim. "What assets do you have that could be liquidated quickly?" "Not enough. The house, the land, they're entailed. Can't be sold outside the family line. Everything else is either already mortgaged or worth a fraction of what we'd need. The artwork? The library? Might bring 20,000 if we're lucky. We'd still be 30,000 short. Then we need to find another way." "There is no other way, Lillian. I'm out of moves." He sank onto a section of wall that was still stable, head in his hands. "I thought I had more time. I thought I could rebuild income streams, establish stability. But a month? Impossible." Lillian sat beside him, her own mind churning. £50,000 in 30 days. It was absurd. Impossible. Unless, what if we don't pay them? He looked up. Then they take the estate, legally. The contracts Carver holds would give him claim to everything. We'd be thrown out with nothing. And if we fight, publicly, You're a duke. You have status, connections. Connections I've ignored for 8 years. Status that matters less than legal documents. And Carver operates in shadows. Trying to expose him publicly would likely get us killed before we reached a courtroom. The bleakness in his voice was absolute. He'd clearly thought through every angle and found them all blocked. There has to be something, Lillian insisted. Some option we're not seeing. If there is, I haven't found it in 3 years of looking. They sat in the ruined wing as the moon rose higher, both of them trapped in the reality of a debt that couldn't be paid and a deadline that couldn't be met. Everything they'd started to build, the fragile partnership, the hope for the estate's future, crumbled under the weight of consequences Rowan had been trying to outrun for years. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have told you, before we married. You walked into this blind and now you're trapped in a disaster you didn't make. We both are, and self-pity won't solve it. Neither will optimism. This isn't something we can fix through determination, Lillian. This is mathematics, cold, unforgiving mathematics." She wanted to argue, but the numbers were brutal and undeniable. £50,000, 30 days. No assets to sell, no income to leverage, no family to turn to. They were trapped. The walk back to the main house happened in silence. Rowan disappeared immediately to his study, probably to review contracts and accounts, for the 100th time, hoping to find something he'd missed. Lillian returned to her rooms where Alice was waiting. "Miss, you look terrible." "What happened?" Lillian told her. All of it. The debt, the threat, the impossible timeline. Alice's face went progressively paler. £50,000? That's more than most people see in a lifetime. "I know. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but there has to be something." Lillian moved to her writing desk, pulled out paper. "I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow, first light, ride to the village. Find out everything you can about this Carver. Who he is, where he operates, what his reputation is. Quietly. Don't let anyone know what you're really asking about. You're going to fight him. I'm going to try. I didn't survive my family's disaster just to be destroyed by someone else's." She started writing a list. "Also find out who the best solicitor in the region is. Not Rowan's London lawyers. They've had 3 years and accomplished nothing. Someone local who knows how men like Carver operate. Lillian, this is dangerous. These aren't creditors who will be satisfied with payment plans. These are criminals. Then we match them. Criminals understand leverage. We just need to find theirs." It was bravado, and they both knew it. But the alternative was surrender. And Lillian had never been good at surrender. She spent the night going through every document in her rooms, every scrap of information about the estate she could find, looking for something, anything, that might provide a way out. Near dawn, she found it. A single line in an old deed, barely legible. Mining rights and mineral extraction limited to specified sectors, excluding western boundaries designated for future survey. The western boundaries. The section of land that included. Lillian grabbed her cloak and ran through the dark house to Rowan's study. She burst in without knocking to find him asleep at his desk, surrounded by papers. "Rowan, wake up!" He jerked awake, disoriented. "What? Lillian? It's barely light." "The western boundaries, the land beyond the lake. Has anyone ever surveyed it properly?" "What? No. It's moorland. Worthless for farming, too far from the mines to be useful." "Why?" "Because according to this deed from 1798, mineral rights on that section were specifically excluded from all future contracts, which means anything there would be outside Carver's claim." Understanding dawned slowly across his exhausted face. If there were minerals there, then they'd be completely ours. No existing claims against them. She slammed the document on his desk. "It's a long shot. Maybe there's nothing there. But it's a shot, which is more than we had an hour ago." Rowan stared at the document, then at her. "You've been up all night. So have you. Looking for miracles in old contracts, finding nothing. I might have found something, or I might have found false hope, but we won't know unless we look." She leaned forward. "Get Thomas. Get anyone who knows geology or mining. We survey that land, today, now, before Carver's men realize we're looking for a way out. Lillian, even if there are minerals, we'd need time to extract them, refine them, sell them, time we don't have. Then we find a buyer who'll pay on speculation, Or we use the potential rights as collateral for a loan to pay Carver. Or I don't know. But standing still means defeat. Moving means possibility. I choose possibility. He stood, energy returning to his movements. You're insane. Probably. Are you coming or not? A real smile crossed his face. Tired, worn, but genuine. How could I refuse? They gathered Thomas and 2 former miners who'd stayed in the village, men who knew stone and earth the way sailors knew sea. By mid-morning, they were riding toward the western boundaries with surveying equipment and hope that felt dangerously fragile. The land was exactly as Rowan had described, wild moorland broken by rocky outcroppings, beautiful in a harsh way but seemingly empty of value. They split up to cover more ground, looking for any sign of mineral deposits. Hours passed. The sun climbed and began its descent. They found nothing but rock and heath and the occasional startled bird. Lillian was ready to admit defeat when Thomas shouted from a ridge overlooking the lake. Everyone converged to find him standing beside an outcropping where the rock face was exposed. "Look at this," he said, pointing to veins of something dark running through the lighter stone. "I'm not certain, but this looks like iron ore," one of the miners finished, moving closer. "Good quality, too, if this sample is representative. And look here." He pointed to another section. "Might be copper. Hard to tell without proper testing, but it's something," Lillian finished. "Something Carver doesn't have rights to." They spent the rest of the day taking samples, mapping locations, documenting everything. By the time they returned to the estate as sunset was painting the sky orange and purple, they had enough evidence to approach investors or lenders. Maybe. Possibly. If they got lucky. Back at the house, Rowan spread maps across his desk while Lillian drafted letters to every mining company and investment firm she could remember hearing about. It wasn't much. A potential discovery on disputed land with no guarantee of quality or quantity. But it was leverage. The first real leverage they'd had. "This could work," Rowan said, but his voice carried doubt. "Or it could take months to develop, and we'd still lose everything. Then we buy time. We show Carver that we have assets in development. We negotiate an extension. Carver doesn't negotiate. That's his reputation. He destroys people who can't pay." "Everyone negotiates when they think they might get more money by waiting." Lillian sealed another letter. "We make him believe that giving us time benefits him more than seizing assets now." "And if he doesn't believe it?" She met his eyes across the desk. "Then we've lost nothing we weren't going to lose anyway. But at least we tried." Rowan came around the desk, cupped her face in his hands. "You're extraordinary. You know that? You've been here 2 months, and you're fighting for this estate like it's been yours your whole life." "It is mine. The contract says so." She tried for lightness, but her voice cracked. "And I don't quit. It's probably my worst quality, but there it is." He kissed her then, sudden and fierce and desperate. Not the tentative exploration of 2 people learning each other, but the collision of 2 people who'd been through disaster and found each other on the other side. It tasted like exhaustion and determination, and something that might have been the beginning of love if they'd had time to let it grow. They pulled apart, breathing hard. "We should keep working," Lillian said. "We should." Neither of them moved. The moment shattered when someone pounded on the study door. Graves entered without waiting for permission, his face ashen. "Your Grace, Mrs. Ashford, you need to come quickly." "What's happened?" "The mines, the old shafts, they're burning." They ran to the windows facing north. In the distance, smoke rose black against the darkening sky. Not one shaft, multiple. Someone had set fires deliberately across the mine complex. "Carver," Rowan said flatly, "he's sending a message. He can destroy what little value we have left whenever he wants." "Or," Lillian said slowly, watching the smoke, "he's destroying evidence. If those mines are burning, no one can survey them to verify his original contracts. No one can prove what rights he actually holds." Rowan turned to look at her. "You think he's covering his tracks?" "I think men who operate through intimidation hate scrutiny, and if we started really digging into his contracts, really forcing legal review..." She grabbed his arm. "What if his claims aren't as solid as he's pretending? What if he's been bluffing this whole time and burning the evidence before we figure it out?" It was a wild theory, built on nothing but instinct and desperation. But Rowan's eyes lit with something dangerous. "Then we call his bluff." "How?" "We go to London. Tomorrow. We take our evidence of the Western deposits, we take his contracts, and we present everything to the Court of Chancery. Force a public legal review. If his claims are legitimate, we lose, but we were going to lose anyway. If his claims are fraudulent, then he's the one in danger, not us, Lillian finished. It was reckless. Possibly suicidal. Carver had already demonstrated he'd resort to violence. Going after him publicly could get them killed, but the alternative was slow death anyway. At least this way they'd go down fighting. We leave at first light, Rowan said. Pack light. Tell no one except Thomas and Graves. If Carver has people watching, we need to move fast. Lillian nodded, adrenaline making her hands shake. They'd gone from trapped to attacking in the space of an evening, from helpless to dangerous. She went to her rooms and started gathering what she'd need. Alice helped, asking no questions but wearing worry like armor. Near midnight, Lillian stood at her window watching the fires still burning in the distance. The mines where Julian had died, now burning as another man's weapon. The estate that had been dying for 8 years, now fighting for survival. And somewhere in London, a man named Carver who was about to discover that the broken Duke and his inconvenient wife weren't as easy to destroy as he'd calculated. Lillian pressed her hand against the cold glass and made a silent promise. They would survive this, or they would burn trying, but they would not go quietly. Behind her, footsteps. Rowan entered without knocking, carrying a small pistol which he set on her dresser. Just in case, the journey to London takes 2 days. If Carver realizes what we're doing, I know. She picked up the pistol, checked it was loaded properly. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, believing ladies should be able to defend themselves. I won't hesitate if it comes to it. I know you won't. That's part of why you terrify me. She turned to face him. Only part? The rest is how much I've come to need you, how much I'd destroy to keep you safe, how much I've started to hope again. And hope is the most terrifying thing there is. He crossed to her, pulled her close. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, I need you to know, these last months, having you here, watching you refuse to let this place die. It's been the first time since Julian that I've felt actually alive. So thank you for fighting, for not giving up on me when you had every reason to. Lillian kissed him, softer this time. We're not dead yet. Save the eulogy. They spent that night in her rooms, not sleeping but planning, reviewing every document, preparing for the legal battle ahead. When dawn broke gray and cold, they were as ready as they'd ever be. Thomas had the horses saddled. Graves had packed provisions. They rode out through the gates as the house staff watched from windows, their faces worried but determined. The journey to London would take them through territory Carver controlled, past watchers and threats, into a legal system designed to protect men like him rather than people like them. But as Lillian rode beside Rowan, watching the estate disappear behind them, she felt something almost like exhilaration. They were moving, fighting, refusing to accept destruction as inevitable. Whatever happened next, they'd chosen it, together. And that, in the end, was the most dangerous thing they could have become. Partners who refused to accept defeat. The road ahead was uncertain and probably deadly. But they took it anyway, racing toward London and a confrontation that would either save them or destroy them completely. There was no middle ground anymore. Just survival or annihilation. And Lillian had never been more ready for a fight. The first attack came on the second day, just past noon when the road narrowed through a stretch of woodland 20 miles from London. Rowan heard them before he saw them. Horses moving too deliberately through the trees, matching their pace. He reached across and grabbed Lillian's reins, pulling both horses to a halt. Someone's following us. How many? At least 3. Maybe more. His hand moved to the pistol at his belt. When I say run, you ride hard for that clearing ahead. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just ride. I'm not leaving you. Lillian, if they take us both, everything ends. If you get to London, there's still a chance. His voice was urgent. Please, just this once, don't argue. Before she could respond, the riders broke from the trees, 5 of them, rough men on fast horses. Bexley led them, his scarred face twisted in something that might have been satisfaction. Your Grace, fancy meeting you here. Rowan positioned his horse between Lillian and the men. We're on public roads. Whatever business you think you have with me, Business is concluded. Mr. Carver's tired of waiting. Bexley gestured to his men. He sent us to collect what he's owed, starting with anything valuable you might be carrying. We're carrying nothing but personal effects. That's so. Then you won't mind if we verify? Bexley dismounted, his men following suit. Unless you'd prefer to make this difficult. Rowan pulled his pistol. I prefer you step back. 1 gun against 5 of us? Not great odds, Your Grace. Good enough to take you with me. Rowan's hand was steady despite the impossible situation. Lillian, ride. Now. She didn't. Instead, she pulled out her own pistol and aimed it at the nearest man. He said, "Step back." Bexley laughed. The Duchess has teeth. How charming. He took another step forward. But also pointless. You might get 2 of us. Maybe. The rest will still take you down, take what we came for, and deliver a message about what happens when people don't pay their debts. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. 4. Then everything erupted. Rowan fired first, catching Bexley in the shoulder and spinning him back. Lillian's shot went wide but made the men scatter. One lunged for Rowan's horse and took a hoof to the chest for his trouble. Another reached for Lillian, but she spurred her mare forward, the animal's shoulder checking him hard enough to send him sprawling. "Ride!" Rowan shouted, firing again. This time she did, kicking her horse into a gallop toward the clearing. Behind her, more gunshots, shouting, the sound of bodies hitting ground. She couldn't tell who was winning, couldn't look back without risking her horse on the treacherous road. She reached the clearing and wheeled around, pistol raised. Rowan burst from the trees at full gallop, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. Blood streaked his left arm, but he was conscious and moving. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit. "They're coming," he gasped. 3 still mounted. We need... A shot rang out, and something whipped past Lillian's head close enough to feel the air displacement. The pursuing riders were gaining, their fresher horses eating up the distance. There, Rowan pointed to a side path barely visible through the undergrowth. Old coaching road, abandoned, but it should hold. They plunged into the narrow track, branches whipping at them. The path twisted sharply, dropping into a ravine that forced them to slow. Behind them, their pursuers crashed through the same undergrowth, closer now. The path ended abruptly at a stream running fast with recent rain. Rowan didn't hesitate. He drove his horse straight into the water, Lillian following. The current was stronger than expected, pulling at the horse's legs, threatening to sweep them downstream. They made it across, but the delay cost them. The riders appeared at the stream's edge, one of them raising a rifle. A shot cracked out, but not from the pursuing men. From above. From the ridge overlooking the stream. One of Carver's men fell from his horse. The other 2 wheeled in confusion, trying to locate the shooter. Another shot, and the second man went down. The third rider made the smart choice and fled back the way they'd come. Rowan and Lillian sat frozen in the shallows, horses heaving, both of them trying to understand what had just happened. A figure appeared on the ridge, tall, military-bearing, holding a rifle with practiced ease. He picked his way down to the stream bank, and Lillian's heart nearly stopped. "Captain Winters? Mrs. Ashford, or should I say, Duchess?" The man smiled. He was perhaps 40, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in rough climates. "Though I have to say, finding you in a ravine being pursued by hired thugs wasn't how I expected our reunion to go." "You know him?" Rowan asked, still wary. "He served with my uncle in India. I haven't seen him in, 5 years? 6. Winters secured his rifle and offered them a hand out of the stream. "I retired from service 2 years back, bought property about 10 miles from here. Was out hunting when I heard the commotion, followed the sound and found you lot playing cavalry and Indians." His expression turned serious. "Who were they?" "Men working for a lender named Carver," Rowan said. "We're traveling to London to challenge his legal claims on our estate." "Carver." Winters spat the name like poison. "I know that vulture. He held loans on half the officers in my regiment, drove 3 of them to suicide when they couldn't pay." He looked between them. "You're going after him? Legally?" "We have evidence his contracts may be fraudulent," Lillian explained, "but we need to reach London alive to present it." Winters was quiet for a moment, then nodded sharply. "My property is 2 hours from here. You'll stay the night, rest your horses. Let me look at that arm. Tomorrow I'll escort you to London myself. I've got business there anyway, and I'd very much like to see Carver get what's coming to him." Captain, you don't have to. The Duchess's uncle saved my life twice in Delhi. Consider this me paying that debt forward. He glanced back toward the woods where the pursuit had come from. Besides, traveling alone clearly isn't working out for you. Come on, before those bastards regroup. They rode to Winter's property, a modest but well-maintained house with good stables and better security. He tended to Rowan's wound, which turned out to be a deep graze rather than anything serious, while his housekeeper prepared rooms and food. Over dinner, they laid out everything: the mine collapse, the debts, the discovery of the western deposits, Carver's threats, the burning of the old mines. Winters listened without interrupting, his military training showing in how he absorbed and processed information. The western deposits are your leverage, he said finally, but Carver will argue they're undeveloped assets with speculative value only. You need more. You need proof his original contracts were based on fraud. We've been through them 100 times, Rowan said wearily. They're airtight, or they appear to be. Then you need someone who understands how men like Carver operate, someone who knows where to look for the cracks. Winters stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. In London, there's a solicitor named Hammond, specializes in cases involving predatory lending. He's expensive, but he's brilliant, and he hates Carver with the kind of passion usually reserved for war criminals. Why? Because Carver destroyed Hammond's brother. Another officer took loans to cover gambling debts, couldn't pay when Carver called them due early, shot himself rather than face the disgrace. Winters poured the drinks. Hammond's been looking for a case strong enough to take Carver down for years. Yours might be it. We don't have money for expensive solicitors, Lillian said quietly. You have mineral rights worth potentially hundreds of thousands. That's collateral. And Hammond will work on contingency if he thinks the case has merit. Winters raised his glass. To bringing down bastards who think they're untouchable. They drank, and Lillian felt something like hope stirring. Not the desperate, fragile hope of the last few days, but something more solid. They had allies now, a plan, a real chance. That night, she and Rowan talked quietly in the room Winters had given them, their first time truly alone since leaving the estate. We're going to survive this, she said, more statement than question. Maybe. Probably. He pulled her close. Because of you. If you hadn't found that deed, hadn't pushed to survey the western lands, hadn't been insane enough to ride into danger with me, we'd already be finished. We're not finished, we're fighting. There's a difference. She kissed him, tasting blood and gunpowder and determination. Whatever happens in London, we face it together. Together, he agreed, and the word carried weight it hadn't held before. They reached London 2 days later without further incident. Winters had hired additional guards, former soldiers he trusted, who rode with them as visible deterrent. If Carver had more men watching, they didn't make a move. The city was overwhelming after months of moorland isolation. Noise and crowds and smoke and life everywhere. Lillian had grown up near London, but returning felt like visiting a foreign country. Everything moved too fast, sounded too loud, smelled too strong. Winters took them directly to Hammond's offices, a suite of rooms near the Inns of Court that radiated professional competence. The solicitor himself was younger than Lillian expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that suggested he approached law like warfare. Duke and Duchess Ashford, Captain Winters spoke highly of your case. Hammond gestured them to seats and immediately began reviewing the documents they'd brought. He worked in silence for 20 minutes, making notes, cross-referencing, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he looked up. Carver's contracts are masterful, absolutely brilliant in their construction. Every clause designed to look legitimate while actually creating traps. So we have no case? Rowan's voice was flat. I didn't say that, I said they're masterful. But perfection is suspicious in itself. Legal documents this complex usually have flaws, drafting errors, contradictory clauses, ambiguous language. These have none, which suggests they were crafted specifically to withstand scrutiny. How does that help us? Because over-engineering suggests guilt, and it means Carver used top-tier legal counsel to draft them, counsel who would have records, precedents, drafts showing evolution of the contracts. Hammond leaned forward. Here's what I think happened. Your father borrowed from Carver legitimately, but when he died, Carver saw an opportunity. He updated the contracts, claimed it was standard refinancing, but actually changed the terms in ways that gave him far more control than the originals allowed. Can you prove that? Not yet, but I can file for court review. Force Carver to produce his complete documentation, including original contracts. If there are discrepancies, and I believe there are, we expose them in public court. Once fraud is established, every other contract he holds becomes suspect. The Crown takes notice. Other victims come forward. His entire operation collapses. Lillian felt her pulse quicken. How long would this take? To file? 3 days. To get a hearing? 2 weeks if we're lucky, month if we're not, but Hammond's expression turned serious. Understand what you're triggering. Carver won't take this quietly. He'll fight dirty, threaten witnesses, bribe officials, possibly worse. You need to be prepared for that. We already survived one ambush, Rowan said. We'll survive whatever else comes. Good. Then I'll begin immediately. Captain Winters mentioned you have mineral deposits that could serve as collateral for my fees? Potentially, pending proper survey. I'll accept potentially. On one condition, when we win this, and I believe we will, I want 10% of the first year's mineral revenue. If the deposits are as valuable as preliminary surveys suggest, that's worth far more than standard fees. And if we lose, then I've lost my time and you've lost everything anyway. I'm betting on us both winning. Hammond extended his hand. Do we have an agreement? Rowan shook it. We do. The filing happened fast once Hammond engaged his full staff. Petitions to the Court of Chancery, motions for document production, formal challenges to the validity of Carver's contracts. Each piece of paper another salvo in a legal war. Carver responded within 48 hours. Not through lawyers, but through action. Hammond's office was broken into, files scattered, though nothing crucial was taken since copies had been secured elsewhere. Lillian received an unsigned note at their hotel. Drop this or your estate burns with your staff inside. She showed it to Rowan, who went pale, but didn't flinch. He's scared. That's a scared man's threat. Scared men are dangerous. So are cornered ones, but we're both, and he's only one of those. Rowan handed the note to Hammond, who added it to the evidence file. The hearing was scheduled for 18 days out. 18 days of waiting while Carver's lawyers filed countermotions and Hammond systematically destroyed each one. 18 days of living in a hotel under guard, unable to return home, uncertain if home would still exist when this ended. On day 12, something unexpected happened. A young clerk appeared at their hotel, nervous and sweating despite the cool weather. He asked to speak with them privately. My name is Porter. I worked in Carver's main office. He pulled out a folder, hands shaking. These are the original contracts from your father, the ones before Carver altered them. I found them in a hidden file Carver thought he'd destroyed. Lillian took the folder carefully, as if it might disintegrate. Why are you doing this? Because Carver killed my sister. She borrowed money to keep her shop running. When she couldn't pay, he took everything. The shop, her home, her reputation. She hanged herself 6 months ago. Porter's voice cracked. I've been looking for a way to hurt him ever since. When I heard about your case, I knew this was it. The documents were damning. The original contracts her father had signed were standard lending agreements with reasonable terms. The later versions Carver claimed were refinancing were actually complete replacements that bore little resemblance to the originals. It was fraud so blatant that even a sympathetic judge couldn't ignore it. Hammond nearly danced when he saw them. This is it. This is everything we need. The originals prove the substitution. We present these in court, and Carver's entire case collapses. Won't he claim they're forgeries? Rowan asked. He can claim whatever he wants. We'll have them authenticated, and I'll subpoena the lawyers who drafted both versions. Someone will crack when faced with perjury charges. Hammond was already drafting motions. This changes everything. We're not just defending against his claims anymore. We're prosecuting him for fraud. The remaining 6 days felt endless. Carver's harassment escalated. Threatening letters, men following them in the streets, a fire at a warehouse Hammond used for storage. But each escalation just added to the evidence of his desperation. The night before the hearing, Lillian couldn't sleep. She stood at the hotel window watching London's nighttime life, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Her forced marriage, the broken duke she'd found, The slow transformation of both of them from isolated survivors into partners willing to fight. Rowan found her there near dawn. Nervous? Terrified. What if the judge sides with him anyway? What if money and connections trump evidence? Then we've lost. But at least we fought. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. A year ago, I would have just accepted destruction, let Carver take everything and disappeared somewhere to drink myself to death. But you didn't let that happen. You refused to accept it. So whatever comes tomorrow, I want you to know you've already won. You brought me back to life. That's worth more than any estate. She turned in his arms, kissed him deeply. Don't give up yet. We might surprise ourselves. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the case, about the powerful lender being challenged by a reclusive duke and his unexpected duchess. Half the crowd seemed to be Carver's people, radiating menace. The other half were curious observers, and a surprising number of people who looked like they might be other victims, hoping to see justice finally catch up. Carver himself sat at the front table with his lawyers, 3 of them, expensive men in perfect clothing. He was smaller than Lillian expected, almost nondescript except for eyes that held absolutely no warmth. He looked at her once, a flat assessment that felt like being measured for a coffin, then looked away. The judge was elderly, severe-looking, with a reputation for being impossible to bribe, but also impossible to predict. He called the court to order and Hammond stood to present their case. What followed was 3 hours of methodical destruction. Hammond laid out the original contracts, then the altered versions, then documentation of when the substitution occurred, shortly after her father-in-law's death, when Rowan was grieving and not paying attention to business details. He produced testimony from the lawyer who drafted the originals, who confirmed under oath that the later versions were not refinancing but complete replacements he'd never authorized. Then he brought out Porter, who testified about finding the hidden files and Carver's pattern of similar fraud with other borrowers. Carver's lawyers tried to destroy his credibility, but Porter held firm, his grief over his sister giving him strength. Carver's lawyers fought back hard. They produced documentation claiming the contract changes were properly authorized. They brought character witnesses who swore Carver was a legitimate businessman. They tried to paint Rowan as a negligent estate manager who'd failed in his obligations. But Hammond was relentless. Every claim was countered. Every witness was cross-examined into contradiction. And throughout it all, the original contract sat as physical evidence that couldn't be explained away. The judge called for a recess after the 6th hour. Lillian felt wrung out, barely able to process everything she'd heard. In the corridor outside, Hammond pulled them aside. It's going well, better than I hoped. The judge is paying attention and Carver's lawyers are scrambling. He paused. But don't celebrate yet. They're going to make one more move, something big. Be ready. He was right. When court resumed, Carver's lead attorney stood and made a stunning announcement. Your Honor, my client wishes to settle this matter. He's prepared to forgive the entire debt, the £50,000 plus interest, in exchange for the Ashford family dropping all fraud allegations and signing a mutual non-disparagement agreement. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered for order. Rowan looked at Lillian, the question clear in his eyes. It was everything they needed, freedom from debt, the estate saved. All they had to do was stop pursuing fraud charges and never speak publicly about what Carver had done. It was also surrender, accepting that men like Carver could operate with impunity as long as they bought their way out of consequences. Lillian thought about Porter's sister, about all the other victims packed into this courtroom hoping for justice, about the principle that some fights mattered more than personal victory. She shook her head. Rowan turned to the judge. We decline the offer, Your Honor. We want full judgment on the fraud charges. Carver's face went purple. His lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him. Very well, I'll render my decision. He looked at the documentation spread before him, then at Carver, then at Rowan and Lillian. I've presided over thousands of cases in 40 years on the bench. Rarely have I seen fraud this systematic and this cruel. Mr. Carver, you have used the legitimate tools of finance to destroy lives and accumulate power. You have preyed on grief, on desperation, on trust. He picked up his gavel. I find in favor of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford on all counts. The debt is declared fraudulent and void. All property claims are dismissed. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Crown Prosecution for criminal investigation. Mr. Carver, you will surrender all documentation related to your lending operations within 48 hours. Bailiff, Take him into custody pending investigation. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Carver was shouting, his lawyers scrambling, and bailiffs were moving to detain him. Other people in the gallery, victims, Lillian realized, were crying or cheering. Hammond grabbed both their hands. "You did it! You actually did it!" Lillian felt Rowan's arm around her waist, the only thing keeping her upright as adrenaline drained away and left her shaking. They'd won. Against impossible odds, against a man who'd destroyed dozens of others, they'd won. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast. As Rowan and Lillian emerged, people actually applauded, strangers who'd heard what happened, other victims who saw hope in the verdict. Captain Winters appeared with a carriage. "Figured you'd need a quick exit before the press descends. Come on." They climbed in and the carriage pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the noise behind. Inside, Lillian and Rowan sat in stunned silence. "We need to go home," Rowan said finally. "See what's left. Start rebuilding." "What if Carver's men—" "He's in custody. His organization will fracture without him. We'll be fine." He pulled her close. "We'll be more than fine. We'll actually have a chance now." The journey back to the estate took 3 days. They half expected to find it burned or destroyed in retribution, but it stood untouched. Apparently Carver's people had scattered the moment their employer was arrested, more interested in saving themselves than revenge. Graves met them at the door, his usual severe expression cracking into something almost like relief. "Your Grace, Duchess. We heard rumors but couldn't confirm." "It's over," Rowan said simply. "The debt is void. We're free." The staff gathered in the main hall, and Rowan addressed them properly for the first time in years. He apologized for his neglect. He outlined plans for rebuilding. He promised that things would change, that the estate would live again instead of just surviving. Lillian watched him speak and saw not the broken recluse she'd married, but the leader he was becoming. Still flawed, still carrying damage, but functional, present, real. That night, they stood together in what had been the ruined East Wing. Contractors had already been hired to begin demolition and rebuilding. Soon it would be something new instead of a monument to loss. "I was thinking," Rowan said, "we could turn this into something useful. A school maybe, or housing for estate workers. Something that serves people instead of just taking up space. A school would be good. The village doesn't have one. Then a school it is." He took her hand. "There's something else. I've been thinking about names. If we have children, I'd like to use Julian as a middle name, not as burden or expectation, but as remembrance. Is that too much?" Lillian squeezed his hand. "It's perfect. He should be remembered, just not worshipped, not turned into an impossible standard. No, just remembered as he was, flawed and real and loved." Rowan turned to face her fully. "I love you, you know. I don't think I've said it properly, but I do. Completely. Terrifyingly. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, even though you showed up in my life like a hurricane I didn't ask for." She laughed, tears forming. "I love you too. Even though you're possibly the most difficult man I've ever met." "Only possibly?" "I'm being generous." They kissed there in the ruins that would soon be something better. Two people who'd been broken separately and were learning to be whole together. It wasn't a fairy tale ending because the work was just beginning. The estate still needed massive investment, the tenants still needed support, and they still had to actually figure out how to be married to each other long term. But it was a beginning, a real one, built on truth and effort and choice rather than obligation. 2 weeks later, the first survey crews arrived to properly assess the western deposits. The preliminary reports were stunning: iron ore in commercial quantities, copper veins that extended deeper than expected, and possibly tin as well. It would take years to develop properly, but the potential revenue was substantial, enough to not just save the estate but transform it. Hammond had been right. The gamble had paid off. More importantly, news came from London that Carver's criminal trial was proceeding. Porter's testimony had opened floodgates. Dozens of other victims came forward with evidence of fraud, extortion, even suspected murder. Carver would spend the rest of his life in prison if the prosecution got even half of what they wanted. Justice, Lillian thought. Actual justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. She and Rowan began the work of rebuilding in earnest. New staff were hired. Tenant farms received needed repairs. The village school was commissioned with Julian Ashford's name carved above the door, not as shrine, but as honest memorial. The estate slowly came back to life. Lillian started a program helping other estates deal with predatory lenders, working with Hammond to provide legal support and financial advice. Rowan threw himself into agricultural improvements and mine development with energy that surprised everyone who remembered the recluse he'd been. They weren't perfect at any of it. There were setbacks and failures and days when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But they kept trying, kept choosing forward motion over paralysis. 3 months after the trial, Lillian stood in the newly renovated main dining room, now actually used for gatherings instead of solitary meals, and watched Rowan interact with estate managers and tenant representatives. He was laughing at something Thomas said, engaged and present in a way that would have been unthinkable a year ago. He caught her watching and smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his severe features into something almost beautiful. She smiled back, thinking about the terrified girl who'd arrived at this estate expecting a monster in a prison. About the broken man who'd been buried alive in his own guilt and grief. They'd both been wrong about what they'd find. What they'd found instead was possibility, partnership, a chance to build something real from the wreckage of their separate disasters. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when that carriage had rolled through the gates what felt like a lifetime ago. It was better. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the moorlands into something almost magical. Wildflowers erupted across fields that had been barren, and the estate, slowly, stubbornly, began to remember what it meant to be alive. Lillian stood in what would soon be the village school, watching workers install the final windows. The building had taken 4 months to complete, every detail argued over and reconsidered until it was right. Not grand, they couldn't afford grand, but solid and functional with good light and space enough for 40 students. "The desks arrive next week," Rowan said, appearing beside her with rolled architectural plans under one arm. "And we've hired 2 teachers, Miss Pemberton from Yorkshire and Mr. Chen, who taught at a missionary school in Canton before returning to England. Mr. Chen speaks Cantonese and Mandarin and English better than most natives. I thought having someone with that kind of perspective might benefit the children." He unrolled the plans on a sawhorse. "I've been thinking about the curriculum. Standard reading and mathematics, obviously, but also practical skills, agriculture, basic engineering. Things that will actually help them whether they stay on the estate or leave for opportunities elsewhere." Lillian studied the plans, fighting a smile. 6 months ago, Rowan had barely been able to plan a week ahead. Now he was designing educational programs and thinking about children's futures. "What?" he asked, catching her expression. "Nothing. Just noticing how far you've come." "We've come." He pulled her close despite the workers around them. "I would have given up a dozen times without you pushing. Still would, probably. You're exhausting." "You're welcome." They walked back toward the main house through gardens that were finally receiving proper attention. The overgrown wilderness was being tamed into something between wild and formal. Lillian's compromise between Rowan's tendency toward control and her own preference for natural beauty. Mrs. Hall met them at the kitchen door, flour dusting her apron. "Your Grace, Duchess, there's visitors. Arrived about an hour ago. Mr. Graves put them in the blue drawing room." "Who?" Rowan asked, immediately tense. Unexpected visitors still made him nervous. "Lord and Lady Henshaw, Your Grace, from the neighboring county. They said it wasn't urgent, but they hope to speak with you both." Lillian and Rowan exchanged glances. The Henshaws were minor nobility with a modest estate about 30 miles east. They'd sent congratulations after the trial, but this was the first actual visit. "I suppose we should see what they want," Rowan muttered, already looking like he wanted to escape. "Be nice," Lillian warned. "We're trying to reintegrate into society, remember?" "I'm always nice." "You're always terrifying. There's a difference." The Henshaws were younger than expected, both perhaps 30, with the slightly worn look of people managing more responsibility than resources. Lady Henshaw stood when they entered, offering a genuine smile. "Duke Ashford, Duchess, thank you for seeing us without notice. We wouldn't have intruded except, well, we need advice, possibly help." "What kind of help?" Rowan asked, gesturing them back to their seats. Lord Henshaw pulled out papers that looked sickeningly familiar. "We've borrowed money. Not from Carver, he's in prison, thank the heavens, but from one of his associates, a man named Blackwood. The terms seemed reasonable at first, but now he's demanding early repayment we can't possibly manage. We've been fighting it legally, but our solicitor says the contracts are solid. Let me see. Rowan took the documents and Lillian moved to read over his shoulder. The language was different, but the structure was identical to Carver's fraudulent contracts. Legitimate-looking terms hiding predatory traps. This is the same game, Lillian said quietly. Different player, same strategy. We heard what you did, Lady Henshaw said. How you exposed Carver and won your case. We were hoping, that is, we wondered if you might know how to fight this, or if you knew someone who could help us. Rowan looked at Lillian. She could see the war in his expression, the instinct to retreat versus the knowledge that they had the power to help, that they'd been exactly where these people were. We know someone, Lillian said firmly. A solicitor in London named Hammond. He specializes in predatory lending cases. We'll write to him today, explain your situation, and arrange an introduction. We can't afford London solicitors. Hammond works on contingency for cases like this. And if your contracts are as fraudulent as Carver's were, you won't owe him anything until you've won and recovered damages. She stood and moved to the writing desk. Let me draft that letter now while the details are fresh. The Henshaws left an hour later with the letter, contact information for Hammond, and visible relief that they weren't facing this alone. After they'd gone, Rowan sank into a chair and rubbed his face. There are going to be more of them, aren't there? More people destroyed by these lenders looking for help. Probably. Does that bother you? It terrifies me. What if we can't help them all? What if we make promises we can't keep? Then we help who we can and we're honest about our limitations. Lillian sat beside him. But we don't hide just because helping is hard. He looked at her with tired affection. When did you become so wise? I've always been wise. You were just too busy being tragic to notice. That surprised a laugh out of him, still rare enough to feel like victory when it happened. Over the next weeks, word spread. Other estates contacted them, asking for advice or connections, or just confirmation that fighting back was possible. Lillian created a system for responding, coordinating with Hammond's office, even traveling to neighboring properties to review situations personally. She found she was good at it, reading contracts, spotting deception, helping people organize their defense. Skills she'd developed managing her family's creditors were suddenly valuable on a larger scale. Rowan threw himself into the mining development with equal intensity. The Western deposits proved even richer than initial surveys suggested. A mining company from Wales offered partnership terms that were actually fair. They'd provide equipment and expertise in exchange for percentage of revenue rather than ownership claims. It'll take 2 years minimum to reach full production, Rowan explained at dinner one evening, maps and calculations spread between their plates. But conservative estimates suggest annual revenue of £30,000 once we're operational. Maybe more if the copper veins extend as deep as the engineers think. That's substantial. It's life-changing, enough to fully restore the estate, invest in improvements, establish trust funds for future generations. He paused. Assuming we have future generations. It was the closest he'd come to discussing children directly. They'd been married nearly a year now, and the question hung unspoken between them. Not if, but when. I'm pregnant, Lillian said. Rowan froze mid-calculation. What? About 3 months. I wanted to be certain before saying anything. Dr. Matthews confirmed it last week. He just stared at her, expression cycling through shock and fear, and something that might have been joy if he'd let himself feel it fully. Say something, Lillian prompted. Are you well? Is everything is fine, normal. Dr. Matthews says I'm healthy, and the pregnancy is progressing exactly as it should. She reached across the table for his hand. I know this is terrifying for you. It's terrifying for me too. But we're doing this. Together. Like everything else. A child. He said it like testing the word. Our child. Due in November, if the doctor's estimates are correct. Early winter baby. Rowan stood abruptly and came around the table, pulling her up and into his arms. He was shaking slightly, face pressed into her hair. I'm going to be terrible at this. You know that, right? I'm going to worry constantly and probably drive you insane with precautions. I know. I'm prepared. She pulled back to look at him. But you'll also love this child completely, and that's what matters. Not being perfect, Just being present and loving and trying. I can try. He kissed her softly. I'm good at trying now. You've taught me that much. The pregnancy progressed through summer into autumn. Lillian continued her work helping other estates until the 7th month, when Rowan put his foot down about travel. She compromised by conducting consultations via correspondence, her dining room becoming an office filled with contracts and legal briefs. The school opened in September with 23 students, more than expected, as families from neighboring villages heard about it and requested enrollment. Lillian attended the opening despite being visibly pregnant and exhausted, because she'd promised the teachers she'd be there. Watching children file into the building with Julian Ashford's name above the door, she felt Rowan's hand find hers. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the emotion radiating from him. Grief and pride and hope all tangled together. He would have liked this, she said quietly. Yes, he would have. Rowan's voice was rough. He always loved teaching people things. Used to explain mining techniques to anyone who'd listen, even when they had no idea what he was talking about. It was the first time he'd shared a happy memory of Julian without the happiness being consumed by guilt. Small progress, but real. The baby came early, mid-October instead of November, in the middle of a rainstorm that seemed determined to tear the roof off. Dr. Matthews arrived looking like he'd swum through the deluge, and Rowan paced the corridor outside their chambers wearing a path in the carpet. Labor took 14 hours, long enough for Rowan to convince himself something was wrong at least 30 times. Long enough for Lillian to remember why women deserved far more credit for this than they typically received. When the baby finally arrived, a girl, healthy and furious about being forced into the cold world, Lillian was too exhausted to do more than hold her while Dr. Matthews handled the medical necessities. You need to get him, she told Alice, who'd been assisting, before he wears a hole through the floor. Rowan appeared in the doorway looking like he'd aged 10 years. His eyes went straight to Lillian, cataloging her condition before finally landing on the tiny bundle in her arms. A daughter, Lillian said. Completely healthy, extremely loud. He moved closer like approaching something holy and fragile. Can I? Of course. She shifted the baby carefully into his arms, watching his face transform as he looked down at his daughter. She's so small. Most babies are. What if I break her? You won't. Hold her head. Yes, like that. You're doing fine. The baby chose that moment to open her eyes, dark like Rowan's, and stare up at her father with an intensity that was almost comical in someone so new to the world. She's perfect, Rowan whispered. Absolutely perfect. She's wrinkled and covered in vernix, and she's been screaming for 20 minutes straight. But yes, she's perfect. Lillian smiled despite her exhaustion. What should we call her? They'd discussed names endlessly, but never settled on anything definite. Rowan studied their daughter's face like it might contain answers. Catherine, he said finally, after my mother, with Julian as a middle name, Catherine Julian Ashford. That's beautiful. And practical. We can call her Cat, which will horrify the aristocracy. Lillian laughed, which heard everything but felt necessary. Perfect. Cat it is. The first months of parenthood were exactly as difficult as promised. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the terror of being responsible for something so small and vulnerable. But they managed it in shifts, Rowan taking the pre-dawn hours when he was usually awake anyway, Lillian handling evenings when she had more patience. Kat proved to be a stubborn baby with definite opinions about how things should work. She hated being swaddled, refused to sleep unless someone was holding her, and had a cry that could probably be heard in the next county. She's going to be difficult, Rowan predicted after a particularly rough night. She's going to be strong, Lillian corrected, like both her parents. By Kat's first birthday, the estate had transformed completely. The mining operation was profitable, tenant farms were thriving, and the house itself was alive in ways it hadn't been for over a decade. Staff had been hired back, rooms reopened, the East Wing rebuilt into a combination school annex and housing for visiting teachers. More importantly, people came to visit now. Other estate owners seeking advice. Families Rowan had known before his isolation. Even some distant relatives who'd written him off as lost emerged to reconnect. This is your doing, Rowan told Lillian one evening as they prepared for a dinner party, their first in the newly restored dining room. All of this. The restoration, the connections, the life. You brought it back. We brought it back. I just didn't let you hide. You did more than that. You showed me how to live again instead of just survive. He adjusted his cravat, still uncomfortable in formal clothing, but making the effort. I would have died in that mine if you hadn't come after me. Literally or eventually, but dead either way. Instead, I'm here, getting ready to host dinner for 12 people, with a daughter upstairs, and a future that actually means something. And you're only moderately terrified? Completely terrified, but doing it anyway. The dinner party was chaotic but successful. Conversation flowed, wine was consumed in reasonable quantities, and several guests specifically mentioned how good it was to see the estate alive again. One older gentleman who'd known Rowan's parents got emotional talking about how proud they would have been. After everyone left and the staff had cleared away, Rowan and Lillian stood in the library, their favorite room, where they'd had some of their most honest conversations. Hammond sent word today, Rowan said, pouring them both brandy. Carver was sentenced, 20 years hard labor, all his assets seized to compensate victims. Justice then, real justice. As close as we get to it anyway. He handed her the glass. He also said 37 other cases have been filed using our trial as precedent. 37 families fighting back against predatory lenders because we proved it was possible. Lillian felt the weight of that. They'd set something in motion larger than their own survival, changed the landscape in ways that would ripple forward. We did good, she said quietly. We did. Though I still can't quite believe it. Some days I wake up expecting to find this was all a dream. You, Kat, the estate restored, the future, that I'll open my eyes and still be drowning in grief with Julian's death fresh and nothing ahead but slow decay. But you don't wake up to that. No. I wake up to Kat screaming because she's hungry and you stealing all the blankets and Graves leaving pointed notes about estate business I'm avoiding. I wake up to real life, messy and difficult and infinitely better than the nightmare I was living. They stood together looking out at the grounds, moonlit and peaceful, showing no trace of the wilderness they'd been. Everything that had been broken was being rebuilt. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But functional. Alive. Real. 2 years after Kat's birth, a second child arrived. A son this time, named Edmund after Lillian's favorite grandfather. He was easier than his sister, content to sleep and eat and observe the world with calm curiosity. We're balanced now, Rowan joked, holding Edmund while Kat attempted to climb his legs, demanding attention. One difficult child, one easy one. That feels fair. Give him time. He might surprise you. Edmund did surprise them. At 18 months, he proved to have his father's intensity and his mother's stubborn streak, a combination that led to spectacular tantrums when things didn't go his way. I take it back, Rowan said after Edmund's third meltdown of the day. They're both difficult. We're raising tiny tyrants. But the complaints were fond. Rowan had transformed into an engaged father, present in ways his own father hadn't been. He taught Kat to ride before she was 4, took both children on walks through the estate, explaining how everything worked, read to them every night from the extensive library. The mining operation expanded steadily. By year 5, it employed 200 workers and generated enough revenue to make the Ashfords genuinely wealthy rather than just titled. Rowan poured profits back into the estate and community. Better housing for workers, a medical clinic, road improvements, support for small businesses in the village. You're becoming a reformer, Hammond observed during one of his visits. The aristocracy doesn't know what to make of you. I don't care what they make of me. I care that people who depend on this estate can actually build lives here. Lillian's work helping other estates facing predatory lending evolved into something more formal. With Hammond's help, she established a legal fund that provided support for families fighting fraudulent contracts. It was small scale, they couldn't help everyone, but it made a difference. On their 10th anniversary, Rowan took her back to the mine where everything had changed. The old shafts were sealed now, properly memorialized rather than left as dangerous ruins. A stone monument stood nearby with Julian's name and the names of the other men who'd died, along with a simple inscription, remembered with love, honored through service. I can come here now without feeling like I'm drowning, Rowan said, standing before the monument. It still hurts, probably always will, but it doesn't destroy me anymore. That's called healing. Is it? Feels more like learning to live with scars. Maybe healing and living with scars are the same thing. He took her hand, wedding ring catching sunlight. 10 years, a decade of putting up with me. You deserve a medal. I deserve a vacation, somewhere warm with no children and no contracts to review. Done. Where do you want to go? Anywhere, as long as you're there. They traveled to Italy that autumn, leaving Kat and Edmund with Graves and a battalion of trusted staff. 2 weeks of nothing but each other, wandering through cities and countryside, remembering what it felt like to be just two people instead of Duke and Duchess, parents, estate managers, advocates. We should do this more, Lillian said in Venice, watching sunset paint the canals orange and gold. We should do lots of things more. Sleep, for instance. I can barely remember what a full night's rest feels like. Edmund will outgrow the nightmares eventually. And then Kat will develop new and creative ways to avoid bedtime, and we'll have another baby. Another? Lillian turned to look at him. I thought we were stopping at 2. So did I. But then I saw you with Edmund yesterday, teaching him to read, and I thought maybe 3 wouldn't be terrible. 3 is a lot of children, Rowan. So is 2. Might as well commit fully to chaos. They had a 3rd child, another girl, Clara, when Kat was 7 and Edmund was 5. She was born in spring, easy delivery, sunny disposition, and slept through the night by 3 months. See? Rowan said smugly. I knew 3 was the right number. You're taking credit for her temperament now? Absolutely. It's clearly my excellent parenting. The estate continued to thrive. The school expanded to accommodate 60 students. The mining company proposed a partnership on a second site that could double production. Neighboring estates started adopting similar programs, worker housing, medical care, education, inspired by the Ashford model. You've started a movement, Thomas observed, now in his 60s but still managing the stables, whether you meant to or not. I meant to survive, Rowan replied. Everything else just happened. That's usually how the best things work. On Kat's 10th birthday, the estate held a festival, the first in over 15 years. Games and music and food, everyone invited regardless of station. It was loud and messy and wonderful. Lillian watched Rowan dancing with Clara, teaching her the steps while Kat and Edmund ran wild with village children. This was so far from the broken man and dying estate she'd arrived to that it felt like a different reality entirely. Quite a transformation, Graves said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of wine. He offered her one. Their relationship had evolved from hostile to respectful to something almost like friendship. Thank you, Graves. For wine, for not giving up on him. On this place. You could have left after the old Duke and Duchess died, especially after Julian, but you stayed. Graves was quiet for a moment, watching the dancing. Someone had to keep the lights on, and I always believed His Grace would find his way back eventually. I just didn't expect it to take a stubborn Duchess to make it happen. I wasn't trying to make anything happen. I was just trying to survive. Like I said, how the best things work. That night, after the guests had gone, and the children were asleep, Lillian and Rowan walked through the grounds as they'd done countless times before. The gardens were beautiful now, structured but not rigid, wild but not chaotic. A perfect balance. Do you ever regret it? Rowan asked. Being forced into this marriage? Having your life completely altered by other people's decisions? Lillian considered the question seriously. I regret that I didn't have choice. I'll always regret that. But I don't regret where the lack of choice led. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. I regret the circumstances, but not the outcome. He pulled her closer. Though I'm starting to think maybe it wasn't entirely forced. Maybe some part of both of us recognized what we needed and just let it happen. That's very philosophical for someone who used to communicate primarily in grunts. I've evolved. You've been domesticated. Same thing. They stood together watching the moon rise over the lake, the water reflecting light in patterns that changed constantly but were always beautiful. 15 years had passed since Lillian's arrival. 15 years of struggle and growth and transformation. The estate that had been dying was alive. The man who'd been broken was whole, not unmarked, but functional and present. The woman who'd arrived expecting imprisonment had found partnership and purpose. Their children were growing, Kat already showing signs of the fierce intelligence and stubbornness that would either make her a force for change or a nightmare for everyone around her, probably both. Edmund developing a quieter strength that reminded Lillian of Rowan at his best. Clara spreading joy wherever she went with natural ease. The future stretched ahead uncertain but full of possibility. The mining operation might continue to thrive, or might face new challenges. Their work helping other estates might expand or might remain small scale. The children might stay close, or might forge completely different paths. But whatever came, they would face it together. Not perfectly. They'd fight and disagree and struggle, but together, as partners who'd chosen each other repeatedly through crisis after crisis. "I love you," Lillian said, the words still carrying weight even after years of repetition. "I love you too. Even though you're bossy and stubborn and you reorganized my study without asking. Your study was a disaster. It was organized chaos. It was chaos. I added the organized part." He kissed her to stop the argument, familiar and comfortable and still capable of making her heart race. They returned to the house where their children slept, and their staff maintained the routines that kept everything functioning. Where portraits of Ashford's past looked down from walls, their painted eyes witnessing the latest generation carry the family forward. In the master bedroom, once Rowan's solitary space, now truly shared, they prepared for bed with the practiced efficiency of long partnership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Estate business, children's needs, correspondence from other families seeking help, the endless small tasks that filled their days. But tonight was theirs. A quiet ending to a day that had been full and good and real. And Lillian fell asleep in Rowan's arms, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong, and thought about the girl who'd arrived at this estate 15 years ago, terrified and alone and expecting nothing but endurance. That girl wouldn't recognize the woman she'd become, wouldn't believe the life she'd built, the family she'd created, the difference she'd made. But she would, Lillian thought, be proud. Because despite everything, despite being forced into marriage with a stranger, despite the debt and danger and struggle, she hadn't just survived. She'd transformed survival into something that mattered, into love and partnership and purpose, into a legacy that would outlive both of them. The estate that had been a fortress of isolation was now a beacon of what was possible when broken people refused to stay broken, when they chose healing over hiding, connection over control, hope over fear. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not the wealth or the title or even the defeat of Carver, but the simple, profound fact that two people who'd been drowning separately had learned to swim together. They'd built a life, messy and imperfect and completely their own, and it was more than enough. It was everything. Outside, the moorlands stretched dark and beautiful under stars that had witnessed 1,000 generations and would witness 1,000 more. The wind moved through the grass in patterns ancient and eternal, and in the morning, the sun would rise on an estate that lived and breathed and grew, on a family that had been forged from disaster into something stronger than fate had intended, on a love that had been earned rather than given, and was all the more valuable because of it. The story that had begun with fear and isolation ended in partnership and purpose. Not perfectly. Real life never provided perfect endings, but real, honest, true. And in the quiet darkness of that shared bedroom, as two people who'd saved each other slept peacefully, that was more than enough. It was everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built together, everything that mattered.